Welcome to another episode of Rocklaz Radio. This is your host Tanmay Shah, and today we are going to South Africa. And joining us is Mr. Desmond Latham, who hosts this amazing podcast, History of South Africa. He's the CEO of Frey Intermedia, an aviation analyst who has flown around the world and appeared on all televisions around the world. He's a Stanford alumni. He has created hugely successful podcasts like SADC Stories, Battle of Stalingrad, Anglo-Boer War, and Plane Crash Diaries. And they have done amazing on all the platforms. So it's truly a pleasure to have an OG on the show with us today. So, OG is, how are you doing today?
I'm so well, Tommy. Thank you so much, and hello to all the listeners and the viewers.
So, OG, if you didn't catch the term, it means original gangster. I mean, who's really a pro or
Okay.
somebody who's been here and seen and done things since a long time.
I'll have to practice my hand signals in that case.
All right. So, how is the weather in South Africa today?
It's a bit mixed. Cold this morning. It's about 8 degrees centigrade where I am in Johannesburg. We're quite high up
Hmm.
here. It's a mile up in altitude, 5,500 feet. So it's
Hmm.
cool this morning, and but the sun just came out a minute ago. So expecting around 22 degrees.
It's so good talking to you because I was just reading a book called Gandhi Before India and his stories from South Africa. So we'll get into all that. Let's first talk about South Africa itself. What is your what is one thing that you love about South Africa?
Landscape. The landscape is so changeable and vast for the population. We're 60 million population, and our country's a bit bigger than Texas, probably half the size of India. Not as vast as your country and not as populous, but the landscape here in particular is phenomenal. You go from scrubby semi-desert all the way to jungles, and tropical, in pretty much everything in between. So I think that's the first thing. Secondly, is the geology. We have a kind of unusual geology affected by meteorites twice, major meteorite strikes, which of course in one
Oh,
case created well, this is 500 million years ago, but that created most of the precious minerals which we're famous for, including platinum. 75% of the world's platinum is reserves are based just north of where I'm talking to you here, and that was created by a major meteorite strike which pulverized the earth and then set off a whole chain of mineral events underground and created a lot of what we're now digging up and selling.
let us quickly show the audience South Africa on Google Maps. So let me know when it appears on the screen. Okay. So as you guess, South Africa is in the south of Africa. So this is the country, and I believe our guest is joining us from Johannesburg, which is right here.
Correct.
And yes, so I was reading about the Boers being here during this time for the mining. So I believe here are the meteor strikes which brought in a lot of the minerals.
Well, the main one is to the south, and as I said, this is 500 million years ago, so there's virtually no sign of it now, except if you look at maps as you are, but you need to look more geologically, and
Hmm.
that created a wave of force which expanded, and from the forces and the temperatures, converted some of the minerals into some of the precious minerals we have, such as gold and platinum, which need very, very unusual conditions, astrophysic conditions, to create those two minerals, which are rare and therefore valuable. So that's underground. I suppose the essence of that story.
Hmm.
Yeah, the second part is we had a large lava extrusions, which created about a quarter of a billion years ago, which created the mountains. So we have quite interesting looking mountains because of the volcanic history. And to the left, where the brown area is the Karoo, the semi-desert, and that is a 300 million year old ocean floor.
Ocean. Wow.
So if you can imagine a flat expanse where the brown is, it's also high. It's well, relatively high. It's over 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet high, but it's flattish, and that's where you find extraordinary fossils going back 300 million years. You can imagine what you find in that area. So that's our geological background, and of course, humans. We walked onto this part of planet Earth, or in fact, emerged from this part of planet Earth. If you look to the south, Alberga, it's called Alberga, which is the CQ. And as you're going in the coast, that area of the coast you're focusing on is actually the origin of life on planet Earth, basically. 200, 300,000 year old cave formations where ancient human artifacts are found there. And the ancient humans on this seacoast are regarded as emerging from there, walking up the east coast of Africa and then into the rest of the world, basically 70,000
Oh,
years ago. So you're looking at really the heart of planet Earth right there. Bizarrely, as strange as it sounds, but Cro-Magnon man, as we know, as hominids, modern humans, in
in
other words, pretty much emerged from there.
everybody
Where you're looking right now,
everybody knows
that's
humans have emerged from Africa, and this is the tip where they actually is the inception.
yes, not right at the tip. If you go to the area, which is if you look up the east coast, as you're going there, you can see those two little bulbs that look like two teeth. That area, yes, just south of that. If you go to the left, and that area is where some ancient cave systems have been found, and I'm talking 175 million years. I mean, 175,000 years. So it's the first kind of proto-humans that began to emerge. The
Hmm.
large middens, which are fossilized mussel and other shellfish middens, some 20, 30 meters high, indicating people lived there for thousands of years, ate the mussels, and then just tossed them into this pile, and they ended up being 20, 30 meters high. As you can imagine how many hundreds and into the thousands of years people lived there. And then from here, genetically, we trace our ancestry into East Africa as humans. And then from about 70,000 years ago, walking through across the Horn of Africa into Yemen. It was dry because of the ice age at the time. There was no sea there. So humans just walked across that area and into the rest of the world. So when I look at this and do the history
Wow.
of South Africa
And
podcast, I'm always
South Africa
aware
is also very
of.
close to the South Pole. Antarctica must be
Well,
very cold.
it looks closer there. We're not as close as Terra del Fuego, the South American tip, but we're close
Uh-huh.
enough. So, for example, we don't get only the highlands of our country, like yours, get snow. Most of the time, it's temperate. So we
Hmm.
not as far south as northern hemisphere countries are north. So our days in summer don't go on forever. They by 7 at night we dark. It's not like it
Hmm.
happens in the hemispheres that are more tilted. We're not that far south. So, but the
And
short
you also have
we are.
amazing national parks. Cougar National Park is very well known and heard of.
Hmm.
And yeah, that and a couple of national parks here. And also a country which is within, like, sharing border only with one country, Lesotho. So yeah, the diary, the
Hmm.
books of Mahatma Gandhi refer to Durban and Johannesburg, these places. So yeah, let's get into that. So these are your favorite parts about landscapes about South Africa. What is one thing you could change about South Africa? What would that be?
I think I'll be anxious to language because we have 11 national languages and we are a diverse country. And this because of post apartheid. During apartheid, the government, which was trying to segment people along race lines and ethnicities, was trying to reinforce the difference basically between people. So since post apartheid, we've had 11 languages. And what's starting to happen is there's a growth towards refocusing on different languages, and I think that's a problem because if you don't have a lingua franca, it's very hard to cohese a society. It's all very well talking about diversity, but if everyone's so diverse, they can't talk to each other because they're using such different language. So that's the one thing I
Don't
change is,
yeah, don't you
is
use a common language like English or something? Like we
yes,
even we have 22 languages, but English is a common thing between.
yes, yes, you're right. So it is. But the sense at the moment is that because it's a colonial language, that there's a need to speak something else. But of course, if you speak something else and you have multiple languages, what language do you speak? And so you
Hmm.
start getting old school patriarchal kind of attempts to talk a language in a region, and then I'm a bit concerned is reinforcing the differences again between people. I'm not talking between races. I'm talking within races as well. So that's one thing I'd change is accepting that we can have our own histories and we can be stable in them and satisfied and positive and confident, but we can also agree that we are one nation. So that's the one thing that's concerning me as a historian is that the signs are there that the country may fracture to some extent. Uh, it doesn't look like it to most at the moment, but as we
Hmm.
chat, you'll see.
Talking about apartheid and the racism there, it looks like South Africa has been the birthplace of modern racism. Would you say that?
And now, in a way, but I also say the British brought it into the country as much as it was there. So it's a long story, but the combination of colonialism, expansion of settlers into the country, which is one of the curious anomalies in South African history, unlike many other parts, is at the same time as America and Australia were being colonized by Europeans technically. The one big difference in South Africa is that the people who were here prior to colonial expansion were not Stone Age like the first peoples of America or Aborigines. They were Iron Age. They could smelt metals, and they did. And they also formed quite large towns. One of the big ironies for me in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the biggest city in South Africa was an African city in southern Africa. Um, the Takong, it was called, which had over 10,000 population. Meanwhile, Cape Town, which was so-called the biggest city, European city of the time, Europeanized, had 2,000 people in. So, there's a perception that South African history is the same as American and Australian with settler expansion, control, the creation of racism and so on. But it's quite a complex tale here because of that. The people who here before whites arrived were living in towns. A lot of them, small towns, admittedly, and with pretty basic health amenities and so on. But that doesn't matter. They were in communities much larger than hunter gatherers. Whereas America and Australia, largely the Aborigines, the first peoples, were hunter gatherers. They weren't farmers. The people living in
Hmm.
South Africa before the settlers arrived were farmers. So that's had a major impact on the understanding of race and how, being the home of racism, your question, modern racism. The short answer is yes, because of the creation of the apartheid state. But of course, that goes back to the way in which the British ran their empire, the divide
Hmm.
and rule systems, and so on. So you're right. We have an unfortunate first prize there in terms of
Hmm.
legislating race in such a cruel and punitive way.
Also, as per my reading, it was mentioned that people were expanding into US, Americas, and Australias, but they didn't have a problem of Asiatic people or Indian people. They were either the natives and they were these settlers or who were coming in. But in South Africa, there were also Indians and Asiatic, as they called them, and they were the major problem because they were competing for the same jobs and resources as these people were. And mostly the people coming to South Africa were from the working class of England mostly, and then the dispute started happening, and then the Mahatma Gandhi story and what things they did.
Hmm.
So it's happening since 1995 or something. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, the history of Southeast Asians generally in Africa and Southern Africa is quite interesting. I mean, for example, the vast number of slaves in the Cape were not African, they were from Indonesia and Malaysia. And there's a culture there of Islam fused with Malay culture, with African culture. It's quite an interesting place to visit to understand that. Indians were pretty late into South Africa, actually, compared to other invasions of people, if you like, and for different reasons. So the British had two big problems. One was labor, and the other was the distance. So what they did when they colonized and eventually annexed the province of Natal, which is on the east coast, where Durban is the capital, they started sugar farms. The colonials started sugar farms. They did, and the Zulu people living there did not want to work as laborers. So what happened is the British looked at the working class in India and said, okay, indentured workers were then flooded into the Durban area from the 1850s, but largely that started happening later, after 1860s. And they could then buy their own way out, the indentured worker. And unlike some of the stories presently in, say, the Middle East, where indentured workers are kind of enslaved forever, largely, and your passport's taken away. In South African terms, the indentured Indian worker moved quite quickly from being someone cutting cane cutter technically, to starting their own farms and moving away. So they could buy themselves out fairly rapidly compared to that. I'm talking about less than a decade. So you had the first generation in Southern Africa of Indians, Indian South Africans, becoming South Africans quite rapidly and empowering themselves through their networks and so on. The vast majority of indentured Indians who arrived in South Africa did not go home when they were offered the choice. They stayed here because they recognized, I suppose, that they had they were the other part of the frontier. People from Eastern Europe arrived as well in different times over the 1800s because of the pogroms in Russia and so on. So you had these waves of people coming in, deploying networks, and then supporting each other. And that's the story of really the start of Indians in South Africa, was the indentured labor and part of the mines. They also were, some were taken to the mines, but it didn't really work. And quite rapidly formed into a network of people who came out of that period as competitors for some of the resources, as you were saying, with Zulu and black South Africans, because they were the lower strata, technically. But they were kind of also infused into colonial society in a better way because of their networking capacity, their ability to speak English, many of them. So it is a fascinating story, and Durban is hugely Indian. If you've ever visited South Africa and you go to Durban, people say it looks to them like somewhere in India at times because of the kind of population you get there. You'll get more than half the people walking around who are Indian South Africans, and because of our capacity to mix as well, despite apartheid's background, you get quite an interesting look around the people that you see there, because there's sometimes African, European, Indian mix of folks as well.
What is the influence of Mahatma Gandhi in present day in South Africa?
He had such a massive effect on our history, and it's hidden a lot of the time. Although his house, I owned a house about a block away from his house in South Africa. So I was infused for some years with an interest in that, of course, being an historian. But the short answer is in many, many ways. I mean, for example, during the struggle era of the 50s, Mahatma Gandhi's teachings of satyagraha and peaceful opposition to oppression were really the rallying call of the ANC at the time, before they turned to the armed struggle. They followed his word largely about fighting colonialism and using a African nationalism, which was like an Indian nationalism that Gandhi had spoken of. It was not a direct copy, I guess, but his teachings and readings, the aspect of being non-violent in particular, being able to deploy that technique to overcome your adversary is really clever, because over time the ANC and the PAC moved into armed struggle because of the lack of response from the white minority, technically. So, but Gandhi, huge. I mean, the second thing is, historically, his effects on people like Jan Smuts, who wrote our first, and it was the first like post-English, with Louis Botha, the post-English leaders of Southern Africa, white, but also Afrikaans, Boer, who had fought a war against the English, and next minute they were, both of them, fighting on the English side in the First World War, for example, less than 13 years after the end, 12 years after the end of the Boer War, they're fighting for the English. Gandhi met with Smuts and had a close working relationship with him through the late, after the First World War, until Gandhi left in the early 20s. Gandhi eventually had enough. He'd been here for 20 years in South Africa. His whole formative phase as a lawyer understanding how to work with both race, diverse culture, religion, because of course there are multiple religions here, and the English and the British Empire, that he kind of cut his teeth in many ways. And for us, in struggle terms and in post-colonial terms, we cut our teeth using his philosophy as to underscore the essence of where we are, where we sit now, in essence. It changed with the need to move to armed struggle for many reasons, but the core messaging, live together, accept everyone, almost biblical in a strange way, resonated. He's thinking, fight the oppressors by marching peacefully towards the police station. You don't pick up arms and attack straight away. It did have
Hmm.
a vast. So those two things, I think, the history of talking to people like Smuts, I don't know if you know this, but Smuts was crucial in setting up the League of Nations. And I feel that some of the conversations he had with Gandhi set some of those parts off, which turned into the United Nations later. So Smuts was really one of the biggest fundamental writers of the League of Nations, which ended up as the UN. Gandhi and Smuts had a relationship through the time. It was a love-hate because Smuts was always talking about the whites and Gandhi was always talking about the Indians. And both of them were fearful of the blacks in some ways. So it was kind of strange economy, but they're also highly, highly gifted political leaders, both those two, Smuts and Gandhi, and very,
Hmm.
very smart. So they were kind of another plane of understanding. So reading the letters between them and also the interchanges, the exchanges, and so on is fascinating. So those are the two things I think underscore that.
Boers. That's very interesting to know. Boers. Where do these people come from, and how did the name come in for Boer?
Boer means farmer. So in the 1652, Jan van Riebeeck, who's the famous Dutch administrator of the Cape, the Dutch East India Trading Company called the VOC, which is the Dutch version of it, was the biggest enterprise on the planet Earth from about 1500s through to about the late 1600s, when they began to be eclipsed by the English and the Portuguese and the Spanish. But initially, the Portuguese and Spanish handed over, I guess, the medal of biggest exporter of goods and shipping nation to the Dutch, who then handed it to the English, to be technically accurate. But what happened is the Dutch had big undertakings in Asia in terms of the spice trade, and they needed a halfway house, which was in the Cape, to feed their maritime, their sailors. And so they set up this little entrepot in Cape Town and kind of did deals with the Khoi who lived there, who were mainly livestock farmers, who had marched into South Africa about 8,000 years ago from the north. They're actually one of the first people, the ancient people. They predate the Zulu and the Xhosa and the Nguni peoples of South Africa by a couple of thousand years. So the Dutch got into a habit of doing deals with them, buying their cattle, because these were cattle herders. And eventually the people who were living in the Cape intermarried with the Khoi to some extent, and also became very rebellious. When they were ex-soldiers. A lot of them were soldiers. A lot of them left the service and started little farms, expanded outwards. As they expanded from the 1600s to the 1700s, they developed their own culture, which is kind of like, they call it kitchen Dutch. It is Dutch infused with African languages, which is interesting. And they lived by themselves in 5,000 or 7,000 hectare farm sizes and bigger, 15,000 hectares, some of these farms, as small nuclear families. And so they developed this culture of moving out and being independent. That's at the heart of the Boer culture, which is to expand beyond the control of a refined, defined administration, particularly the English. They really do hate the English and fought two really terrible wars against the English in the 1800s. First in 1879-80, and the second was in 1899, the Boer War, which was horrendous with some of the effect on civilians. So that's the story of the Boers. So they
What?
have a history of being independent and traveling around in these small nuclear
Hmm.
families, being able to move with their wagons, and then a dislike, or intense dislike of the English and the British Empire, kind of fused into the culture. And they're still around. I mean, the Boers are very powerful. Afrikaans turned into the Afrikaner culture. That independent spirit, unfortunately, led in 1948 to the apartheid state's introduction. And that independent spirit morphed into a more poisonous concept of protecting their whiteness against external African forces. So what was infused with an African understanding at first, with this curious European African lifestyle which they'd built. I mean, many of them married African chiefs, wives, daughters, and were actually beginning to infuse into Africa in the late 1600s through 1700s. By the late 1700s, early 1800s, they'd begun to try and defend their whiteness. It wasn't like that always in the Boer culture, which is, unfortunate for us, because if history had been different, we wouldn't be talking about apartheid.
Mm-hmm.
And so that fear of the majority morphed into protecting their white skins against black, and it became what we know as apartheid, yes.
Mm-hmm. So what highlights would you give from the Anglo-Boer Wars?
Well, there's a huge number. The first is that, Churchill was a war reporter and was taken prisoner by the Boers. He was almost shot. He had a handful of dum-dum bullets, which are soft-nosed bullets which explode on impact, which are banned in warfare. If you get caught with that, you can be shot in modern war. And back in the day, it was also banned. And he was caught with a handful of these dum-dum rounds when he was captured. And the Boer soldier was going to shoot him. And the officer arrived, the Boer officer, and stopped the soldier. So that the world history could be somewhat different from that moment. So that's the first thing, is that you had one of the biggest world leaders of the 20th century who was involved in war reporting, was captured, and then he ended up it ended up affecting his whole political life, because he emerged from South Africa as a hero, and he after that became was actually voted in as an MP following that, and he used that experience to become politically important. So that's the first thing. Secondly, Gandhi and Churchill actually passed each other at a battle here called Spionkop, which is renowned. And the Kop, which is many British soccer grounds have the Kop. That Kop is actually named after that war, Spionkop. It was so deadly for the British. They renamed some of their stadiums at the time. I think Liverpool's the most famous example of the Kop. Comes from that battle. So Gandhi and Churchill walked past each other on the mountain. They didn't know that. They wrote letters, and they realized later, when they were kind of arguing about things, that they'd actually passed each other at that battle, and they didn't recognize, because they didn't know each other. So you have this. That's the Boer War has these kind of almost historical moments that are fused in there. Secondly, all the British officers who fought in that war fought in the First World War, and cut their teeth, if you like, on warfare through that. Thirdly is the unfortunate introduction of concentration camps. The British threw the Boer women and children in concentration camps because it turned into a guerrilla war. So to weaken the men, they took the women and children away, so they didn't have any kind of logistic support out in the veldt, on the plains of South Africa, and threw them into concentration camps where 36,000 died. It was about 25% of the entire population, of the Boer population, died. So you can imagine a quarter of your population dying. The intense emotions from that time exist to this day because of that period. But the word concentration camp emerged from that. And in fact, the Germans told the British that they were using concentration camps in the Second World War based on the British experiment, saying, you started it, we just perfected it.
Oh no.
So I think those are some of the unfortunate, there are many, many other things, but that's in the essence.
Why did the Boers hate the English people so much? Because they were white skinned after all, both of them, and they wanted to rule over the colored people. So why did they fight so much between each other?
Great question. Because the Boers had been expanding from the Cape from the early 1700s to escape administration, and they wanted their own lifestyle. And the British kept catching up to them. So it was all fine, really, with some disputes, the normal stuff between people who don't like to be ruled by other people, until the 1860s, when diamonds were discovered in Kimberley. And Kimberley became by far the biggest diamond production area in the world for the next century. And the British financiers in London wanted to England and Great Britain, the empire, to take control of that land. And the land is partly, was very close to what one of the Boers' first republics, called the Orange Free State. And so the British, by expanding, and then they expanded it into Natal, And the Boers had identified Natal because the Boers did not want to keep using Cape Town as their main port. They wanted to become independent from the English, so they were targeting Durban as the other port, and also Maputo, Delagoa Bay, which is further north in Mozambique now. They were targeting those two ports. And suddenly the British then annexed in the 1850s. Annexed 1845, they kind of annexed Natal, took over Durban. So the Boers felt constantly that their rights were being usurped by this empire, kept pitching up and taking their things. And then the Big Bang happened in 1899. 1896, a huge amount of gold was found in Johannesburg environment. The British financiers again moved in, some from the diamond-bearing areas further south, bought up a lot of land. They began to compete for land. The Boers, who by then had started a second republic called the Transvaal, which is where Johannesburg and Pretoria are, felt once again the British had rocked up. And then a huge number of English working class arrived to work the mines, wanted the vote. The Boers did not want to give them the vote because then they'd vote the Boers out of their own republic. Once again, it was the British arriving, trying to take stuff away from them. So you can see for them as being hounded, constantly hounded. They regarded, both the British and the Boers regarded the Africans on the veldt as the second interesting thing to take note of. The first thing they were really worried about is each other. And this is what often happens in peoples. I always say to people, your biggest competitor is the person who looks like you, not the person who doesn't look like you. They're the easy ones to deal with. The people who are the hardest to deal with are the ones who look like you, because then they have to prove that they're different. And and this is what happened in the terms of the whites fighting the Boers and the English, is the Boers wanted independence, the English wanted control of the mines and the land on it. Bang was the war, in a nutshell.
From intermingling and marrying the local blacks, per se, so they were so infused with the native culture. Then what made them change? Like, we need to protect the white skin, or we need to have that, we need to protect that. What brought that mindset? First you want to grow families with them, and now you want to be separate and protect yourselves. Why?
They were trying to export a version of Europe into Africa. That's in essence. So to protect the version of Europe, they would protect the color of their skin, because they would see that as part of the landscape, I guess, is to say, what makes us different? What makes us so-called civilized? And therefore it must be the color of the skin, apart from the culture and the religion. So one of the things that happened is Khoisan people became religious very quickly, became very Christian very quickly. And the Griqua and the mixed race South Africans, the coloureds, they're known in South Africa, which is a legal term here. It's not a term of abuse, which it is in other parts of the world. Then built like another form of a colonial on the land. They were mixed, and they used firearms and horses like the colonials, but they were black technically. And Afrikaans, the language that the Boers speak, is actually an African language, which was spoken by the black and mixed race South Africans first. So we do live in a contradictory country. So in fact, the Afrikaners, the original name for the Afrikaners, are black Cape dwellers of the 1780s and 90s. So they were the real first Afrikaners, and they happened to be black. So I think the fear of losing something on this great expanse is like a sea. The veldt in South Africa is flat, it's wide. It's like being marooned on an ocean. And psychologically, it has an effect on humans. So they wanted to then separate themselves. So one of the ways, the easiest way to do that is how you look, is to say, this is what you should look like if you belong to this culture. That then morphed into the 20th century disasters that we had with kind of testing people's hair to see if it's black hair or white hair and stuff like that, which is, it's when you think of it now, the destruction that caused people's lives. Imagine kids and the effect it had on their sense of self and so on. One minute you think you're one thing, and then he told you something else, and then the law says you're a third. It's a real poison in human consciousness, this thing of responding to how light your skin color is and whether or not you're top class or bottom class. And in your country, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That's the essence. They wanted to retain their so-called Europeanness on an African continent while becoming African. So it dealt with people became schizophrenic, to put it mildly. Now, they were happy to not be Dutch or English, but also happy to be South African. But then they were white South African and not just South African, and so on and so on. So that's in essence. And then the second thing is fear. Fear of a group of people. So they used fear quite well here to try and turn all black South Africans into something, make them all the same. And they're not. I mean, there's a vast difference, like in your country with the different speakers and tribal areas and clans and dialects. You try and make all those people one people because they just happen to look Indian, and you're making a big mistake. Yes, we all need a sense of self and cohesion, but you can't. So, because the color of the skin then turns into that cohesion was a deadly mistake that was made. And so they would say, those are the black people. This is how they act. So whether they're Xhosa or Zulu or Pedi or Tswana, this is how they do these things. And this is how we do our thing. And of course, when a lot of Xhosa and Zulu and Pedi and Tswana and others turn into Christians, then it becomes very hard because the original narrative on the felt was heathen, black, Christian, white, which emerged in the early 1800s as a philosophy.
Where do your lineage, do you trace it back to the English or to the Boers, or it's mixed?
I have a strange lineage. Mine goes mainly to the English, but also the French. So I won't bore you with too many details, but my DNA is Turkish. I'm from Eastern Turkey, the Macedonian, Iraq area. So that's my ancient DNA, which I had tested because these are important things in South Africa. And my other part of my DNA is Algerian, North African. So, but I've red hair and green eyes. So, but that's just a layer on top of my original genetic ancestry, as I'm sure you're aware. So my immediate past goes back to my great-great-great-grandmother who actually eloped as a 16-year-old from British Columbia in the 1880s. And that's where the British line comes from. And that line goes all the way back to the Mayflower, and the first arrivals in America of the early 1600s. So that's on the one side. My father's side is French, mixed with Scots. That's the new version. And then, of course, now South African.
You said that testing DNA and finding your lineage is very important in South Africa. Why?
Because we all kind of have this perception of who we are, and it's always wrong. 90% of the time it's wrong. So you'll find people saying, I am pure English stock. And then they find out they're not. That they, whatever this pure thing is, which is a myth. It's a myth in human consciousness and our scientific background, biology. It's just a myth. If you think you're pure, you're sadly mistaken. Because no one is so-called pure. We're all pure human, which means we're mixed. We're mixed humans. So it's, for some people, it became important to prove that they were very white, or very black. I have a very good friend who's black, who's an Africanist. And he, in the early 90s, he used to say to me, you don't belong here. You belong in Europe. You're a pale face. And I'd say, really, my first language is Zulu, actually. I grew up speaking an African language. It was my home language. And my home language is English, but that was my first language I spoke. So I said to him, you can't tell me where I think I belong. And he said, I can, because you look like this. And I look at me, and he's very dark of skin color. Anyway, he had his DNA tested and discovered that his ancestors are Italian. So, so that completely shifted his worldview. He suddenly realized, and if you look at his face, he looks Italian. If you take the color away and you just suddenly look at it and you realize, oh my goodness. And he said he felt suddenly, and he went to go and visit his origin, blessed origin, which is southern Italy. And he said because of, he obviously psychologically felt at home. So he said he felt at home because he knew he was at home scientifically. But beyond that, it completely altered his politics. He turned from being kind of, I suppose, a fundamentalist, saying, all Africa for all Africans, Europeans for the Europeans, India for the Indians, that kind of person, to which is kind of crazy because the world doesn't work like that. You could have said that maybe 300 years ago, but now, when I can hop in an airplane and I can visit you in but 8 hours flight, we'll be saying hi and sitting on your rooftop, and vice versa. You can come visit me. In these modern days, to say that you belong here and you belong They're so old-fashioned. Anyway, that's the reason, and many people are now curious and not threatened. So I had some Afrikaans person reaching out to me saying that he discovered that his mother's line is actually Indian. And he showed me a picture of his mother, and she looks Southeast Asian, but she's Afrikaans. And their ancestry goes back 200 years in South Africa, and yet his mother now looks part Indian. So this
So the
ancient,
features are Indian,
yes,
but the color is black.
no, but no, her color is mixed,
Hmm.
white, European,
Hmm.
Indian, mixed. But if you look at her carefully, and the family spoke about this, but because they were fearful in the past of discovering something, everyone kept quiet about it. If
Hmm.
you revealed that you had black past or Indian past, you'd be removed from the list of so-called white people, and then you wouldn't have access to schooling the same level and so on.
Hmm.
So he was very proud of the fact that his mother's ancestry is from Mumbai, and going back to the late 1700s, 1780s, he tracked his family into India on his mother's side. And if you visited him here, you'd think he's Dutch or Afrikaans, and yet he's part Indian. So
Hmm.
nothing destroys your preconceptions more than discovering, if you believe or if you understand science, that you can break that back of predilection and
Hmm.
preconception. So that, I think, is why it's happening here.
In very interesting to know. In upper, what were the horrors of apartheid? Because there are so many cultures and colors and where people want to belong and where they want to be separated from. It's surprising that it still went on till 1980s, 1990s. So, what were the worst horror? I mean, you might have seen some of them through your own eyes.
Yeah, I was a journalist for years, and also just because I have knowledge of history in the country and growing up amongst the Zulu people of Southern Africa. I think there's a number of layers of horrors here. The first is that families were destroyed by this process because one of the family would they're called try for white, as they used to say. They would pass themselves off as white, and then they'd split the family because they could never come back and speak to their granny, who was black perhaps, because they had to prove they were white, and they could not cross over the line. So it broke social nucleuses of family, destroyed them. So that's pain
So,
and
you had to
suffering.
live separately. You couldn't meet them again.
I know you could meet them, but they'd preferred not to, because the neighbors would talk, any kind of thing would set off a chain of events that you couldn't control. Then, so that's one layer. The other layer is legislative, where black people were kept off the land, and land was given to whites first, and all kinds of infrastructure facility was then given to whites rather than blacks, under the pretense that they were separate but equal. They used to call it. In other words, we'll give the same amount to whites and blacks, but that was not happening. So there was deformed economic growth and a disempowerment of black people. The third thing, which is in the latter stages of apartheid, was pure unbridled violence and oppression, murder, death squads, shootings, tortures, detentions without trial. People I know were thrown into jail fighting for the rights of the majority of South Africans to have a political voice, and they were tortured, their lives were destroyed, some of them were killed. So that's the end result of a nation state that loses touch with its ethics and believes it has a fundamental right to pursue its own race or ethnographic fundamentalism blows itself up eventually. In our country, we're a small country, so it happened quite quickly. But for bigger countries who go through this, they face the music at some point where reality comes, because none of us is purely Christian or whatever we may be, as much as we like to believe we are. And if the contemporary politician that breathes that kind of false smoke into our faces dies, and the young generation moves away from that simplistic thing. And then, of course, the world shifts. So the resources and geopolitics shift. So anyone who's preaching the gospel of us and them, eventually the reality that we live in breaks that down and shatters it. So, I mean, apartheid, those three layers, I think, are the things. The stories of human individual life destroyed, the stories of communities unable to achieve because they were identified. And the third was the violence and the torture aimed at individuals who were preaching post Gandhi struggle philosophy, which is, we all are equal, we all have the right to vote, and then being
Hmm.
killed for it.
Nelson Mandela is known, famous for this, and your first prime minister. What is your favorite quote of by him?
Who? Nelson Mandela.
Yes.
Which is education. His quote on education is as the door through which all growth and all improvement. I think that's, for me, the guiding light of what he left South Africans, because he himself, while he was in prison, kept trying to educate himself, and never deviated from that line. And then secondly, I think the children of the future. He was like a great grandfather to South African children who loved him, because he's just like a grandfather. When he walked in the room, he had that effect on people. And I met him a number of times, of course, and interviewed him as a journalist. And like Gandhi and the other real powerful people of history, he could very quickly reach empathetic and compassionate place in every person he met. A straight connection, the human connection. So I think that the dealing with the children, everyone's a star. Each child is a future star. Those two things, education and children, I think are the things that he imbued us with, or we try to, those who think about it.
How did you feel when you first meeting and talking to him?
Well, he'd just been released from prison, and I was with 6 other journalists who were identified to sit down with him in his little house. He had a small house in Soweto, Orlando. He had a big house later, but his first little house was literally a matchbox. I took about one main room and one little room off it. Tiny place. And we met him, and tea was made for us, and we sat down. And there were 7 of us, me and 6 others. And we just sat there, and he was sitting looking at us. And no one could ask him a question. Why do you ask a person like that? Who's presumptuous enough to want to ask someone like that a question? So we're just sitting there. And I'll never forget that experience. And he kind of laughed, and he said, no questions. And he kind of broke the ice, and then we started asking questions. I spent some time, I was the so-called township reporter in South Africa because of my language skills. So I speak 5 languages. And so I ended up meeting him quite often in the worst possible place. And the negotiations between the ANC and the National Party, the Afrikaans Party of the time, almost broke down over a number of incidents of violence here. There was a small-scale civil war that broke out. When it became apparent that the National Party was losing power, a lot of smaller kind of movements tried to seize power through violence. And I used to bump into him at different places, and he used to refer to me by my first name, which always felt, I was always terrified of him, because he was just so, he had such a capacity for memory and for understanding the big picture and the small picture simultaneously. So I think watching him deal with people on various levels always amazed me, because that was a person who spent almost 3 decades in jail, and yet he walked out of there into a stadium of 170,000 people, and he spoke to them like there were 2 people in the stadium. He had the capacity to he wasn't grandiose. So that's what I liked about him most. Is his ego was his people. He was, you could talk to him as a normal person, and he would expect that of you. So I was always in awe in public, and when he spoke, generally people kept quiet. He would wait, and then he had capacity for just saying something at the right time. It was the right thing, and everything would settle down. So I think that's those little pictures of him.
27 years in the prison. 27. I mean, how does one deal with living 27 years, 1/3 of their life, or even half of the life for many of them, living in the prison? What was the state of mind of Nelson Mandela living for 27 years in the prison?
They tried to break him at first. They took the rights away. He couldn't see his children growing up. He couldn't see his wife, and they would feed him false information. But then the latter stages, when negotiations started and the South African government started facing pressures, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1988-89. They began to treat him. They'd really put him into a special house, not a cell. So he was living in like a small house with his own chef and his own personal assistant and his own guards, who treated him more like a head of state, actually, bizarrely, than a prisoner. So for about 5 years before he was released, he was not in a hardcore prison as we know. He was more in an area where the National Party at the time, the Afrikaans government realized, and the whites realized, that this was an important person. They would keep him alive. He had some health issues, so he had the top doctors dealing with him. And they gave him what he wanted to read. So from the second half, once he had, I'm talking about probably mid-80s, so after he'd spent half that period in jail, he began to access books and other things, and he had better meetings with his family. So I think that eased things mentally for him. It was not solitary confinement for 27 years, which would have broken, I think, just about anyone. And also they began to, he was aware of the world's movements in his favor. Everyone was talking about him at one point, and he was not allowed to see things. But by the latter phase of his incarceration, he was allowed to read newspapers. So for the last 3 or 4 years, he was up to speed with world events. It was like he'd been in a special boot camp for his future and the country's future. It was not as if he just came from chalk to cheese. He had emerged slowly into the real world and then emerged into the sunlight, into freedom after that. It was not like he just came from a prison with no access to information straight into the world. So I think that helped.
What was the reason he was put into the prison? And if he was so harmful for whatever the reason was, why did they just keep him in the prison and keep him alive?
He almost got the death penalty. There were the treason trialists at the time. He was planning to blow up police stations and some infrastructure, some power lines. The important thing about the ANC at that time was they were embarking on a struggle against the security forces. They weren't targeting the civilians as they did later in
So
South
just
Africa.
a step back for the people who don't know, what is the full form of ANC, and does that refer to the African?
African National Congress.
So it is made up of
Yes.
the people of color.
Not only it was a movement designed around to free the people of color, if you like, but it had all races. It had famous Indian, white, and colored, and black leaders involved in it. That was the important thing. The principle was everyone fighting for the rights of
And
freedom.
the nationalist party was the ones who wanted to have these segregation in the society, mostly made up of whites.
Yes, exactly.
So he started planning to blow up police stations and rebel.
Yes.
And
Yeah, well, it wasn't just him, it was the movement. He was part of that movement. And funny enough, he was a moderate inside radicals, and he had first warned about that in the late 50s. And by 1959-60, he was actually involved in some of the planning for these things. And being a lawyer who's aware of the effect this would have, so he became more and more politicized and took action. And Mkhonto weSizwe, which is the spear of the nation, is the armed wing of the ANC. And Mkhonto weSizwe launched itself and began to pursue things such as blowing up power pylons. And he was implicated and was involved in planning some of these. So they were captured at actually a house owned by a white South African in Johannesburg. And they were put on trial, and the state wanted the death penalty. And it was converted to life. Or else he wouldn't be here either. You know, as with the Churchill story, it was a close call for our history. That's someone like him. And it would have been no one else because it was someone like him had to. Only he, I think, at that stage could communicate and do what he did and have the leadership qualities. So the trial was 1961-62, went to jail for life, supposedly. And that was the fear. The state at that stage, it was prior to the bombing campaigns that killed civilians. And there's another group of people called the Pan-African Congress, which my friend was. I told you about the person who was pontificating about what race belonged where. He belonged to the PAC. The PAC is very hardcore back in the day, and even now they still believe this philosophy that all whites should go home, and Indians, and only blacks should live in Africa.
So it's
So,
opposite of the whites.
yeah, well, I mean, it's yeah, you can say so. They were the direct opposite. The PAC was the direct opposite of the National Party, and as people radicalized, with the majority, 80% of the country is black, with the majority of people being denied the rights to access the good land, proper education, proper health. It was easy to radicalize sections. But even with that said, the majority of black Africans in South Africa were not that radical. They didn't want to kill whites, which is what the PAC wanted to do. Their big trick was to go and shoot school children and blow up golf clubs and things like that. And the average South African is not a murderous person of any race. Not a murderous person who wants to go and kill other people and don't look like them. So the PAC is now got no one in Parliament, for example. They don't have a single seat. They've given birth to something called the EFF, Economic Freedom Fighters, who use a lot of their language, anti-white, vituperative, and with our economy in shambles, it's easy to try and drive a lot of youth into radicalization. So they've kind of taken up the flag, if you like, of all whites go home,
I want to
wherever
give
home
a
is.
yeah. I want to give a shout out to Miriam Makeba, who the one
Mm-hmm.
song which is very popular by Jane. She that is actually dedicated to Makeba, and who was a singer from South Africa against the apartheid. So
Yes,
that
Miriam Makeba is one of our struggle heroes. She sang about freedom as well, and was not really politicized per se. She was really dealing with pop art. There was a period in South African cultural growth in the mid-50s where, when apartheid began to be reinforced from 1948, they passed laws all the way through to the early 60s, 1960s, which were punitive against blacks. And in the 50s, you had this typical big city. Johannesburg is very similar to an American big city growing. It had the gold, a lot of money flowing in it. It had a lot of relationships between races going on, like normal cities. And Miriam Makeba kind of became big at that period. It's the drum period, it's called, in South Africa, where there's a lot of jazz, post jazz music, and you could hear the first phase of rock and roll coming out. It was not so she's identified from that period as the funky period of South African, just before apartheid really got hard in South Africa. So
now we have a set of questions that we want to know from every country. What is your favorite festival in South Africa?
we're such a diverse people again that the favorite one probably is Christmas, in terms of folks going home, because South Africa is a migrant labor country. So a lot of people working in the cities don't live in the cities, or they do now, but the majority still travel around a lot. So you'll find people use the period from mid-December to mid-January to go away. So that's the Christmas period. It's called the Christmas holiday period. That's when construction companies stop and people move or travel with money and goods and food and things, and back to where they came from. So that's, I think you could call it the celebration. It's not necessarily a religious ceremony for us. It's more a time and a period of the year when migrant workers move home. And so it's revisiting family members and so on. So I think that's what I'd say.
What is one wedding ritual which is very peculiar to your country?
This is a sensitive one, because the modern metropolitan woman and man don't do this in this way anymore. But basically, you have to pay for your wife in cattle. And the more important your wife is, the more cattle you pay. Heads of cows, basically. So what's that? It's morphed into a situation where a man who takes a wife has to pay the wife's family in certain goods over a period of time. It's a dowry system called lobola. And so the modern woman hates to be seen as chattel, passed off a few cows. So it's some kind of process is still undertaken by the majority of people going through this African black Africans, South Africans, still do this in one way or another. But it's one of the areas in which the modern world and the modern metropolitan woman is not exactly enamored or happy with the idea that she's about to be traded off. Permission given by dad and uncles, basically, for you in your life. It's kind of old fashioned. So, but it also is a really important process for the cultural reason that you tie your ancient ideas and ways of life into the modern. So people do it, but they do it in not as a crude manner as, here's a few cows, I want your daughter kind of thing. It's more,
Figurative.
yes, we'll have a big party and let's go on a holiday together. And then the family understands that there's a payment being made here. And you will have to pay some cash sometimes because granny needs some money for a house. So it's not as violent as the woman having to pitch up in an old-fashioned outfit and then some cows being herded past. But that's, I think, the big one.
It's reverse of what used to happen in India. In India, the woman had to give dowry to
Huh?
the man's family.
Mm.
What is a traditional dress that you like very much in South Africa?
The Ndebele have the
Can
beads,
can you spell that? I'll
famous
just pull it up and show to the audience.
Endebele,
Okay, that is a
Endebele.
long spelling. Can you type it in the chat box?
Yes, I'll do that. So let me just put it in here. Ndebele and designs. So I think the Ndebele designs are the ones that Ndebele. Yeah, there. The Ndebele people are part of the Zulu and Nguni peoples. We have two strains of black South Africans. One is the Tswana Sutu. They come from different parts of Africa, and the other is Nguni. Nguni come from Ghana area, West Africa, and the Tswana and Sutu come from. It is debated, but some say near Tanzania originally, and so on. And then Ndebele are part of the Nguni, in other words, the Zulu Xhosa group of folks. And that style, the Ndebele color, is, I think, some of the most recognized.
This one?
Yeah. That infuses Ndebele and Zulu, but that's what's happened in South Africa. It's not strictly enforced anymore. People see these color codes and mixture. They tend to mix up their Zulu and Ndebele, for example, cultural totems. But that, you can see the color and the use of color and the use of those triangular designs. The Ndebele are famous for that. If you look at the hat carefully, and
Has
you'll see
this have these colors inspired the South African flags? The bright yellow and
they
green.
did. Yes. Yeah, they did actually. The designer of the flag looked at the Ndebele art in particular. You can see it there, and said, "Okay, what colors are involved in our cultures? The importance in cultures." So those colors all come from a place, but the idea, you can see the triangle in the Y.
Yeah.
That is the Ndebele triangle. If you look on the women's outfits you're looking at, you'll see these color triangles and blocks. If you look up on their hat, you'll see there, and also the beads. If you search Ndebele beads, you'll see how they have that kind of motif. So very much so.
Yes.
You see
Also,
there.
this Zulu is a different. I mean that it came up when I was searching for it. How are Zulus different from the Ndebelés?
Well, the Zulu people are a different language for a start, similar sounding, similar words, but different language, and their ancestry is slightly different. So the Ndebele from the north of South Africa, further north from the Highveld, whereas the Zulu emerged from the southeast coast near Durban, Zululand, which is in the patch of area between southeast, which is Durban, all the way through to Mozambique, the east coast, if you like, on the warm coastal region. So
You
that's
said
a historical.
you said you speak Zulu, right? Which language do you
I
speak?
I speak Zulu, Xhosa, English, Afrikaans. I can speak Ndebele, understand it, Iswazi, but I lump those into like the fourth, which I can kind of understand. and speak, but I speak with a Zulu. I insert Zulu words. So Ndebele, Xhosa, and Zulu have similar words. Zulu has 4 clicks. Xhosa has 13. So, and
Clicks.
Xhosa has clicks. Yeah, clicks. Like that. The different words and vowels are pronounced in different ways, 13 different ways. And that comes from the Khoi. The Khoisan speak the world's oldest languages, going back, 100,000, 80,000, 70,000 years. And we know this because linguists tell us this. And also the click languages that the Bushmen, the San speak, works your face muscles, your throat, and your jaw the most out of any language. So they know that the San is the original language, because if you practice it, you can actually speak it. But at first, it's just crazy because there's so many clicks.
Namibia. They are from Namibia, right? Mostly.
Yeah, and Botswana. And they're originally from South Africa, but they were moved out through years of, I suppose, being destroyed by both the Nguni. They were kind of co-opted by the Nguni as servants a lot of the time, and as rainmakers, by the Xhosa in particular. And then when the Europeans arrived, the Europeans tried to exterminate them. The Dutch actually used to hunt them on the veldt like animals.
Oh
So,
my.
yeah, so they then moved north into where they are now, Namibia and Botswana.
Oh, amongst these 5 languages, which is your favorite one?
I
Because
mean,
we have a
English, because
question related to that.
I mean, English is for me the most, because it's just given me opened so many doors. But the language that I romantically like the most is Zulu. This is Zulu because
Okay.
it's my home. It comes from my home. I grew up. That's the first language I remember hearing, from the nannies that looked after me
Hmm.
on the farm. I lived on a farm
Okay.
in Zululand in the middle of nowhere called Inkweleni. So that's it's very close to my romantic spirit. That language, yeah.
Could you please close your eyes for a moment?
Mm-hmm.
Think of your favorite memory
Mm-hmm.
and tell that to us in the Zulu language.
Uyazisikhathi ingane utholile inkomo duze ikhaya lami, le mfethu naye ubuthi lami, ubonile imfazi utshele wonke, khuluma nami, woza uthathe inkomo, uthathe phezulu, le nduku ufakile, na in umoto futhi ubonile izolo, manje mthambam ufuna wonke ukhwele phakathi uthole inkomo hamba phezulu naye, mfazi naye, ebesho wakho ufake le nto, uthathe wonke, hamba nyawo naye imoto, siyabona imthambam cabanga 7.
Wow. I like the sound of it. Could you please translate what you said in English?
I said that we sometimes my brother with the lady would come to us and say, we need you to go and take the cows. There may be a car coming and it'll be tonight. You need to take the cows up. Just look out for the car. It may come around, but the ladies will be there. And remember to put on your apron, beshu, and we'll see you tonight or later at about 7. So the ladies and the women are very important everywhere, obviously, but in Zulu culture, it's a matrilineal line. You get your line through your mother's brother, because it's a warrior culture, and all warrior cultures, such as the Vikings and so on, all use their mother's lines, because the father would die, being a warrior. So there's always a link to your past using. So matriarchy is very important in Zulu culture, and it's patrilineal. It's a patriarchy, but it's matrilineal. It's a male-dominated society, warrior culture that gets its main line is through its women. So
Very
women,
interesting.
when I was growing up, women on the farm I grew up were very, very vital in making decisions. Black women and white women, actually. So it's one of the anomalies of of culture, I think, is you have this very strong male dominant. The more warrior the culture, the more important the women are, because they're the survivors.
They are the one who manage the empire behind after the men are gone to the wars.
Pretty
We
much.
we saw that with the Mongolians as well. I mean,
Yes. Yes.
the previous
Mm.
episode was with Mongolia, and we spoke about how he Genghis Khan used his wives as political assets as he expanded the empire.
It's an anthropological fact. I'm a student of anthropology and history and journalism, and you just go through world's cultures, and this is just a fact. Doesn't matter what color, which part of the world, the more violent and warrior-like the men are, the more the women are important. I'm stating the
Hmm.
obvious. I mean, it's a 50-50 here in our globe, and it sounds trite and almost silly in a way. But if you look, as I said, you just spoke about the Mongolians. I've spoken about the Zulu. The Viking culture of the Nordic nations is the same. So you have this human reality that builds over eons, which is that you better hand over power to the woman and take your name from your mother, because your father is kind of somewhat irrelevant. He's not going to be around for very long. He's going to be charging off to go and commit murder somewhere and be killed himself. So you better deviate and look more strictly and take your leader from your mother and your mother's family. It's really important. Ironically,
How would you appreciate something if you want to say something is beautiful, or I like this, I really like this? How would you say that in Zulu? A thing or a person?
Yathanda Lintu. Yathanda Lintu. I like this. Mnandi. It's nice. It tastes good. It looks good. Yathanda onke. Lempatlo waka. I like it. I like your goods. I like what you're wearing. Yathanda. I like it. That's the simplest phrase.
Jatan. Okay.
Yathanda. Mm.
What is your favorite local food?
Pap and meat. So that's the big word. Pap is mealies, which is corn, ground corn.
Can you type it? I'll
And
pull it out the images of it.
so PAP or mealies,
Hmm.
and then meat, beef, largely. Sorry, I mean, I know it could be an issue, but beef or meat generally. We're a big meat eating culture.
Cattles
So,
and
yeah, cattle, sheep mainly, and goats. So, it's really important to our cultures is to on all sides. So there's the
mm,
pup, which is like doesn't look very tasty, I know, but it's extremely, for people like us, it's really important food with
mm.
a gravy of some kind, normally a tomato-based gravy, quite often with chilies, and then yeah, that's pretty much what you see in most plates in South Africa,
Mm.
with some kind of meat. So it's very basic, because remember, we come from we kind of boxed above our weight division for some time. We're really a developing nation. It pretends we developed. We put in the middle area of developed nations.
Mm.
But we
So
have
how? Yeah, go ahead.
no, but we have real threats because of our economy and unemployment. So basic foods is like you've just shown there is what we eat, majority of us.
What is a favorite activity that one must try when they are in South Africa?
Outdoors. So it involves going to the beach, probably. The modern South African really likes to do that. It's post-apartheid. Going off out of the big city somewhere to meet with some kind of family event. So you get dragged into a braai. That's something you have to do. A braai is a meat-based barbecue where we make fires, throw various types of meat, chicken, fish sometimes, and vegetables. We kind of grill the corn or something, drink some beers, um,
Yeah,
talk for an hour or two. That's the thing you got to do when you come here. Is you got to be invited out to a braai, and all cultures, Indian-based, South African, Black African, White African, whatever, we all do it. You'll get dragged out to a braai. So it's just a matter of saying yes and then deciding culturally which one appeases your religion most, or whatever you're allowed to do, and then you'll find the place. So if you do come, I'll invite you to a braai, and we'll have various types of meat. And we're
Wow.
very used to halal in South Africa. So when we make braais, a lot of us, we make on different fires. So we have, or for our Jewish friends or something. So we're used to making food that's kind of split, but we eat together. But to make
Hmm.
sure that it's properly halal and so on. So, and the same with vegetarians. Hindu vegetarians in South Africa have a lot of the restaurants of our country are very used to that.
In your LinkedIn, you it was mentioned that you're a rugby coach. So
In
you
Stanford, years ago, yes, I coached women's rugby of all things. And in 1993, 4, which is when I studied at Stanford, there was no women's rugby in South Africa. So I walked past the table in the orientation week and saw women's rugby, and I'd never heard of that, coming from a male dominated culture in South Africa. So I stopped and said, "What is this?" And they said, "Who are you? You've got a very strange accent." And I said, "I'm South African." They knew about the rugby playing from here. So they said, "Have you coached rugby?" And I said, "No, but I played quite seriously up until university level." So they said, "Well, don't you want to coach us for a couple of weeks because we were waiting for a coach?" And I said, "Sure, if I can." And it ended up with me coaching them for the whole year and
wow.
going to playoffs. I know. And I coached 2 women's rugby teams there at Stanford for a year. We went on the West Coast playoffs, and it was an immense experience because of being Ivy League players, even though women or men doesn't matter. I'd show them a move, backline move, or the scrum, which is the scrum formation. I'd show them a move, and then I'd go and train the backline, or vice versa, and then I'd come back to the scrum, and they'd say, "Oh, we've gotten 5 other examples of what you showed us." So they were very easy to train, very smart kids.
Wow.
Um, so I loved training them because they were all highly motivated, and it was very nice. I was a student, so I couldn't earn anything, so I did it for nothing really, except just because I felt obligated in a strange way. Anyway, when I got back to South Africa, they sent me a check which paid for some of my house purchase,
Wow.
um, because they said it's honorarium. In terms of honorariums, you can get a single one-off payment, and I was completely stunned. I did not expect it. So I have a very warm memory of training the Stanford women. Unfortunately, we didn't go through the playoffs. We lost by 1 point in Portland in '94, and that's always been something that stings my memory, as you can imagine,
One
not being
point.
able to go through. But the players and the memories of training them was remarkable. And of course, they had these 30 or 40 women playing just rugby, which is extremely violent sport. Okay, it's like American football but without helmets. And next door to us was the Stanford official football team practice. 300 of these guys. When they finished practice, they all used to run around and stand around this field where I was training to watch these women do this stuff because they couldn't believe there were no pads, no helmet, and they go crashing into each other. So it's a sport that's not for beginners. I always tell people, they say, I played soccer seriously for a large period of my life as well. And I always tell them soccer is like 10%. You have to have the mental capacity, 10% of rugby. Rugby, you're going to fight every week. You're actually having a fight with like 15 other men. Or this is no place for someone to pitch up to. Or cricket. I love playing cricket.
Hmm.
And people, mentally playing cricket in my mind is much easier than rugby. Rugby is a terrifying sport to have to
It's
play.
like a wrestling soccer. I used to play rugby in college, that's why I remembered it. And my coach was from South Africa. And he used to talk about the barbecue culture had come into the team on the weekends and all they used to go. That's why I remembered that when you said about Bry. So, yeah, another quote about rugby is it's a hooligans game played by gentlemen, and soccer or football is gentlemen games played by hooligans. So even if
Yes.
there is so much drama and so much, actually people are bleeding, but nobody is going to argue with the refs in rugby. But in soccer, if slight bit like they are like drama, I mean they just roll over and they pretend that a lot has happened.
Yes, it's pathetic, actually. I understand why they're doing it, is to try and get a win and so on, but there is a limit to it. And of course, in rugby, you play the game really hard, as you know. And when the whistle goes at the end, you shake hands and you go and sit with the opponent and you have a glass of beer or whatever it is. And there's no hard feelings. So it's a lovely sport to play if it's played properly, rugby, and if it's trained properly. It's less dangerous than it looks. And of course, more people have died playing cricket than rugby because cricket is someone throwing a giant rock at your head. And back in the day, if you got hit, you're in hospital. So I always tell people cricket has actually killed more people than rugby. And rugby just looks more dangerous.
What position did you play?
I played hooker, which is in the scrum in the middle. And then later, I was a bit small. I'm only 5'7", so I ended up playing backline. I played wing or
Hmm.
center mostly. And you?
I used to play lock because I
Okay, you
was
tall, in other
tall.
words.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it
Need
was
those
really
long
fun.
levers.
Yeah, like it's like the powerhouse or engine during the scrum.
That's right. That's
Like
right.
your
Yeah.
face is between two thighs crushing you, and then you have to
Yes.
keep
Yes.
pushing forward. It's really fun, and then lifting people in the line outs or
Yes.
it's a lot of fun and a lot of memories related to that game. But I didn't continue much because I was getting concussions, and then after a
Mm.
couple of them, I said,
No, you got to
"Let's
stop.
just yeah."
Yeah. No, I was like, yeah, I didn't get concussions. I damaged my tongue a bit at once, quite seriously. Went to hospital, and then I eventually ended up with a spinal problem, but not from rugby. I had a childhood disease. I actually had to stop playing for a couple of years,
Hmm.
and then went back to playing later. So I broke my wrist at university playing rugby. But good memories like you.
What is your impression about India?
I've never been there, so that's one of my wannabes. I want to travel to India. I'm a big follower of IPL, the Indian Premier League, because there are a lot of South Africans playing there, but also just because of the spectacle of it. It's really well put together, so I like that. And being a student of history, India has always interested me from the concept of pre-Sanskrit, ancient cultures. The home of much of world culture comes from India, language and so on. So it's always been a country of interest, and also because politically we were closely aligned during the period of apartheid, where Indian government supported the South African exile movement at higher level, being non-aligned in the rest of the world, facing European nations and now China as world powers, and being in the middle of these guys. I was always interested in India's take on things, and your culture is phenomenal. I mean, looking at the hundreds of years of culture and what you've been affected by, and then lastly, of course, the food. I make curry all the time, and curry is very South African now, bizarrely, because of Indians coming to South Africa in the 1860s, as I said. So curry is probably the other national food that we didn't mention. If you go to a restaurant, if you go anywhere in South Africa, you'll find curried food, and so I think that's worldwide. Everyone knows your food, your curries, but in South Africa we have a real Indian curry concept
Hmm.
where we are used to eating hot food. When I say curry, this is real Indian curry that I've been fed on. That makes it's
Spicy.
made by it's very spicy, made by little Indian ladies who used to make it and were taught how to make it by their mothers, and and it goes back to pre
Hmm.
the days in which the ancestors came from India. So we don't have the kind of watered down, Europeanized, Americanized curry, so-called curry here. No, no, our curries are strictly proper. They're spicy. Indian curry is famous in South Africa. If you want a proper curry, you go there. There
Hmm.
are whole shops selling spice. That's when I go to Durban, I just go straight to those shops and buy sacks
How
of
is
the
the
spices.
how is the African Zulu or the food of other tribes? Is it like what? How does it taste like? Is it as spicy as Indian or? in between or bland?
No, it's mostly bland with some chilies. So you'll find some people will infuse some of their foods. Chakalaka, for example, one of those pap sauces, the red sauce that you saw on the mili pap there, is called chakalaka. It comes from a mixture of things, including carrots, and that's made can be made quite spicy. So our brand of chicken here, all of the brands sell spicy chicken. So you can't go to like a Kentucky here or a similar thing without having they all sell spicy chicken. So whereas internationally or in America, I've just come back from a couple of months in America, you don't find that kind of spicy chicken. And when they say it's spicy, it's not spicy.
It's
It's
still
like
very bland.
vaguely tastes of a pepper. Whereas, yeah, if you go to the chicken, you ask for spicy chicken, it's going to make your lips tingle, and it's definitely spicy. So I think, yes, there's been a use of chilies over the years. It's now become part of African diet. I go throughout Africa generally, traveling a lot, doing things, and you'll always find okra, onions, chilies, and tomatoes
Mhm.
in the foods. Very seldom you find no chilies.
You have traveled the whole of Africa and you have started a company, Frey Intermedia. What is it about? It spoke about Pan African communication and community.
Yes, we do social media campaigns for people. We do social media videos and videos for YouTube. Mentioned the SADC success stories. We do op-ed writing, typical content and media work for advocacy. The woman who owns it is an African woman who believes in advocating first. So we don't work with corporates as much as UNICEF, Oxfam, the United Nations,
Mhm.
different organizations of that sort, women's movements. So we tend to work with them mainly, and some corporate work. That's it. So we do all kinds of messaging, multimedia, animations, working
What
with
are
cameras.
what are your views with BRICS?
BRICS is a contentious group, to put it mildly. I think that the idea of not being someone created BRICS. In other words, we are not the G8, rather than what are we? So that's for me. When you set up an organization of people based on what we're not going to be, you have a problem. You have a problem about a dream. So I think BRICS is an excellent idea, but it's unable to really exist at the start of the idea. I mean, South Africa's involvement as a small nation compared to especially Russia, India, and China is one thing. Brazil's relationship is also post-colonial. You understand as an African living in Africa, I like the idea that organizations work together, but also as a global person, I just think that what the Russians and Chinese are up to in terms of what their needs are, nation state needs are, is counterintuitive when it comes to what Brazil, South Africa, and India want,
Hmm.
particularly India and China, because India and China are in competition over the Himalayas region, and to be sitting in the same box, if you like, pretending to be all friends, when we have serious territorial disputes is, it's just crazy. And also our human rights record. South Africa likes to pride itself, although there's some shambolic recent things have taken place. We like to pride ourselves on not doing deals with dictators or being part of the oppressive world. And here we are in a relationship with China, which has put 1 million Uyghurs into concentration camps. And there's no freedom. There's no freedom of voting. I mean, India is a democracy. You can vote whatever you think about parties and politically is separate from this, but you can technically vote. The same in South Africa, the same in Brazil, but you cannot do that in Russia and China. And yet they're sitting in the same group. So I think that there's a tension there,
Hmm.
philosophical tension that I think is real and is just fudged by people who like to have a narrative of it's at least we're not American. We can all agree we don't like America. Well, that's all good and well, but what do you actually agree on? You don't agree on borderlines. You don't hardly agree on currencies. 1 minute it's the renminbi one, next minute it's the ruble. What is it? What is it going to be? So
They're making a new
that's my view.
one. They're making a new one, right? BRICS, a cryptocurrency. There's a proposing.
Well, I think there is a new one called blockchain. So that will probably end up with Chinese misgivings about it. But I think because the Russians are into blockchain and the Indians and the South Africans and the Brazilians, it's just the the Chinese are in two minds about this blockchain business. But why not use that? But I'm with you. I mean, we've been talking about currencies for BRICS since the start, 2013-14. I don't see it ever happening because, the reality is China is the big boy in the room. So, and the BRICS Bank, they've got by far the most money invested in the BRICS Bank, the New Development Bank, as it's known. Where is it based? Shanghai, or Beijing. So it's not based in
Hmm.
Rio de Janeiro, and it's not based in Delhi. So, there are issues here that BRICS is good because it's not the EU, but that's why it's good. It's not good because it's BRICS. And I think that the BRIC leaders need to figure that out.
It was in the news that if Putin comes to South Africa, he needs to be arrested immediately. But there was some video that they won't do it. And what the ICC has to say. What do you comment on this whole situation?
Well, I mean, the ANC and MK that we were talking about minutes ago were supported by Russia during the struggle, and there's a relationship between the ANC government now and Russia. So that's put them into a spot of bother, to put it mildly. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is supported by quite a high percentage of South Africans, based on the fact that Russia supported South African freedom movements during apartheid. And it's a romantic illusion, basically, now, because we're in the modern world, but you can understand the need, the emotions around that. So that's the one thing. But the second thing is we are a member of the ICC. We are a signed member, and America is not. So for America to tell us to arrest Putin when he arrives because we're members of the ICC is a bit rich. But having grown up in the period of apartheid and seen dictators at work shooting people, I mean, my personal opinion is that Putin should be in jail already. But that's my personal opinion. The geopolitical thing here is that there's no ways that anyone would touch him because there'd just be carnage and chaos. We knew some months ago that he wouldn't be coming to BRICS. I mean, to the BRICS summit in South Africa. So for him now to say, I'm pulling out is a bit rich. Lavrov, his foreign minister, is coming, or he's here. And that whole thing is that we've forgotten our past. The party of Gandhi, which is the ANC, the party of Mandela, was going to entertain a man who's firing missiles into creches in Ukraine, who's blowing up churches last night, who's attacking civilians, and setting off devices that are killing lots of people in cities. He's a war criminal. So, and his future, I'm sure we will all see in a patchy way in the future. So to allow someone like that to pitch up my backyard, about 12 minutes from where I'm talking to you was where he was going to be at one point. I was going to join the people flocking there to see if I could raise a flag or two and say, make some noise, bang a pot, perhaps. It was going to cause big problems in South Africa.
Hmm.
The churches here are wary of it. And the people my age, 50s and 60s, who fought apartheid of all races, just do not like the idea that we could allow someone like that into the region. Geopolitically, whether you hate America or London, that's irrelevant. You've got to look at the other side. So this is a man who is going to, at some point, have to face the fact that he's taken action, both in Syria and his involvement there with arms and bombs and so on, and in Ukraine. So this is separate from what America gets up to, because when we talk about these things, someone says, "Oh yes, but America is selling bombs and so on." And I'm saying that's true. So we need to deal with that. But you asked me a question about BRICS and Russia, and I'm giving you the answer.
Hmm.
I'm not giving you an answer because I don't like America. I'm giving you an answer
Hmm.
because I think So it was going to cause problems here. There were going to be protests, big ones, against him, and it's getting embarrassing for our leadership. One minute they're pandering to the G7, next minute, our biggest trading partner is the EU by far. China sells us a lot, but they don't buy a lot from us. Some raw materials.
What is the
The
biggest
EU is the
export
biggest.
of South Africa?
Is manufactured goods and then resources. So those are the two things that we export. Manufactured goods like foodstuffs and other things, and then resources like iron
It's also big on
and
diamond, right?
coal. Diamonds, not as big as it used to be, but yes. Diamonds is a small percentage of that resource export. It's mainly coal. It's raw materials. This is our problem, like other countries with resources. We export our raw materials and we import a manufactured version that we just sold a country like China. We buy a car back from them with our bits of our metals in it. So, and having sold them the coal to use on their power stations to make a piece of plastic that I can buy for 100% markup. So it's one of the unusual things going on at the moment is the Americans and the Europeans are trying to compete again with the narrative which Russia and China has been using in Africa to try and recover some of the lost ground caused by Trump, who damaged the concept of working with developing nations like mine. The Americans are trying to do that. And the Europeans are trying to gather their minds around the fact that Africa is one of the biggest marketplaces and youngest ones. So we are a growing market. It's very strategically important for their factories that we buy their stuff. So that's the emerging reality of what we sell. It's raw materials largely, and tourism is 20%, up to 20% of
20%.
our
That's a
GDP.
big one.
Yeah,
Like, it's huge.
and dropped to 8 based on the damage done by COVID. So
It must have taken a big hit in the whole economy of South Africa then, because 20 is a huge percent.
3% minus 3% growth. So that was caused by both a poor administration of the economy by government and corruption in conjunction with pandemic. It was like a double whammy for us. So,
And talking about tourism, many of the people come there for the sharks also, right? Shark and
yes.
Cape Canaveral, Cape Town.
Yeah, Cape Town. That's and the whales. So we have white sharks, which are huge things. They're the biggest shark in the sea, apart from the basking shark. And we have a lot of cage diving. So people go down in cages to dive with the sharks. They moved around a bit because of climate change going on our coast. It's changed the water temperature slightly. So these things have moved a little bit. But yes, it's a big thing to do here, is to come along, be dropped in an iron cage underwater and see the shark that is 4 meters long swim around you, which is terrifying, apparently. I'm not going to do that, thank you.
You have so much knowledge about history and journalism, but you also have about technology, about aviation. So, how did your interest in aviation develop?
I've always been fascinated from a small child. In 1969, I was 7 years old, and I heard we didn't have television in South Africa until 1976. We were one of the latest users of TV, but I heard the radio of the landing on the moon, and that moment kind of will remain with me forever. Just the sound of people talking on the moon, and made me realize that you could kind of do anything. So to this day, I'm very much an early adopter of things. Of technology. I ran a tech company for 10 years, 99 to 2008. I ran a mobile phone app company in the early days of applications when Nokia still ruled the roost. Nokia had 90% of the phones in the early 99 to 2003-4. Had a very high percentage with BlackBerry. So my company designed apps for those phones. So my whole history has been a combination of science and art, fusing the two. I'm also a guitarist. I play music as a professional and did for until 2019. And that fusing the idea of science and poetry and art together is a really important part of my makeup. So flying, I just love doing it. It's a science that is also an art.
So, you are a pilot? Do you
I'm a
fly?
pilot. Yeah, I fly. I'm a PPL, private pilot. So I'm not paid to fly. I just fly because I love it. And I've been doing that since 2008.
Wow.
And well, I mean, I don't do as much as I'd like, but I do fly a single engine planes. At the moment, something called a Cirrus SR-20s, which are glass cockpit computerized planes, very, very, very nice aeroplanes. So yes, so there's always been an interest, I think, sparked by that landing on the moon, where hey, you can do anything just because you're old or you're young or you're male or female or whatever language you come from, ethnicity. As long as you have an interest in the world, and you can teach yourself. You can, if you have that energy. Don't wait for somebody to teach you to do it. So I've always been naturally, like, insanely curious, and then living on a farm. We had nothing on the farm. I mean, I didn't wear shoes till I was 6. And having nothing around but your imagination, I think was quite fortunate actually, because to this day I can keep myself busy with these just a pencil, piece of paper and a pencil. I can keep myself busy for hours.
It just occurred to me: is it offensive to call somebody Boer in South Africa?
No,
Okay,
no, depends how you do it.
okay.
Yes,
So it's not all. You said Boer means farmers, so then that's
yes.
how I said. I wondered if everybody, all farmers, are also called Boer, or it's just that Dutch lineage.
No, it's a kind of mainly a lineage. I mean, English speakers call themselves Boers as well, Boere, which means farmers.
Hmm.
It's become a general word. Even black South Africans sometimes call themselves Boere. But when it's used ethnically, it just means Afrikaans speaking person, and they're not necessarily farmers. They could be anyone who speaks the language. So it gets confusing. But like all other things, it's just a word.
Afrikaans language, how different is it from Zulu or the other language that you described? Is it a mixture of Zulu and English or Dutch?
No,
What is Afrikaans?
well, there's a lot of English and a lot of other languages, including Zulu, in it, but it's Dutch. So it sounds like Dutch. So as ek met jou nou praat, if I'm going to talk to you now, and say miskien geskiedenis, history. So that's geskiedenis is history. You can see it's got a guttural G sound, which is Dutch, not German, more Dutch, and it comes from Dutch.
Hmm.
It was called Pidgin Dutch by the first speakers, and then it infused with some French, because French Huguenots arrived from France in the 1780s. They were being oppressed by the Catholics, so they fled, and a large number came to South Africa. So a lot of South African names, Duplessis is French actually.
So most of the
So
Africans are Catholics, or what is the
no,
composition?
no, most of South African Christians are have an called the Ethiopian sect. It's a group of people who are very tied to the Old Testament, Christians,
Tired.
and
Tied up or
so
tired?
connected to
Tied
connected to
up.
the Old
Okay.
Testament. Yeah, tied up. So they relate more to the Old Testament. A lot of Judaism built into it. It's Christianity, but there's a strong element of that. So it's not Catholic as much as it is infused with a Southern African or African Christian take on it. It's unusual. It's a Moria church. It's called. A couple of million people show up at the Easter festival. It's not like Orthodox Church. It has animism infused into it. So people believe that some of the trees and some of the lakes and rivers around where I'm here are infused with God's power, and so they go to those rivers, and then they have special festivals there. They're Christian festivals, but they also about the river. So, which is an interesting idea of combining the landscape and knowledge of ancient principles of African religion and Christianity together. So it's
That's
not just
beautiful. It's
Christianity.
beautiful. I've never heard
Hmm.
of this before. So you call them Ethiopian sect, or
Yes,
how?
or the
What is the
Maria
name?
Church,
Maria Church.
the
Okay.
the Maria Church, and um, they dress a certain way. They dress with outfits and uniforms, and they have little badges, and they have hats. They have serve different functions in the church, and you can see people walking on the street that dress. They're very proud of their position in the church, and it's 99% black. It's very much linked to very old various rituals and traditions in African
Hmm.
culture here. But it's Christianity. I mean, the people wear crosses, they believe in Jesus, they sing songs, they read the Bible, the preacher preaches, but often there's an infusion of and the landscape into it. So they will meet at a tree, and a tree will
Hmm.
be protected, was identified with the ancestral powers linked to God, and that kind of thing.
Beautiful. Coming back to
Mm.
aviation, Elon Musk is famously known for coming from South Africa, and his grandfather used to fly planes. The fun fact is, he used to change the engine of the plane as per the availability of the fuel. If it is diesel, then diesel engine, otherwise petrol engine, he used to convert into that. So, what are your views on Elon Musk's grandfather?
I don't know much about him, but it makes sense though because diesel planes are now a big thing as we transfer out of some other fuels that are used. Avgas, which is the fuel used in propeller planes, and Jet A1, which is basically paraffin, which is a form of energy power, which is used around the world to power lamps, for example, Jet A1. So
Kerosene, sort of.
yeah, kerosene. That's what it is, and using a diesel engine in a plane makes sense because of it's there's less chance of a problem occurring with a diesel engine. The only problem with diesel engines in airplanes is once their term of life is expired, you have to chuck them away. Unlike petrol piston powered or petrol powered piston engines for planes, where you can renew the parts and refurbish it, but you can't do that to diesel.
So imagine
They're basically
yourself
done.
being in his position and having to mold the engine or change the engine of a plane wherever you land and according to what fuel is available. How do you feel being in
Yeah,
that position?
well, I mean, it makes some sense, but it seems to be a little bit of a waste of time. I just land where you can get the fuel, or B, you make sure that the fuel is where you can land. But it's easy enough for me to say I wasn't flying around in the 60s or the 50s or whatever time that Elon Musk's grandfather was flying, the 40s, 50s. What we do here is because we don't have a lot of facilities, we make sure that the place we're flying to has the fuel. And most of these places have some kind of arrangement where you can phone them a week or two before, or a few days if you're lucky, and the owner of the airfield goes to buy the fuel and puts it in a 20-gallon drum, and when you land, or 40-gallon drum, you just pump it into the plane using a hand pump normally, or some kind of electric pump. So that seems to me a cleverer way to do it than taking my whole engine out of the plane. But I wasn't around back then.
Hmm. What is your favorite story of flying? You said you also love landscapes, so I guess that's what inspired you to fly. Uh, Anyways, what is your favorite memory of flying?
Oh, there's so many. I mean, the favorite would be, I think, my first solo. You go, you trained and then you take off in an airplane by yourself. That is a significant moment in your life because it's hard to explain, but you're doing something that you're not really supposed to do. I don't have wings and I don't have feathers. So here I am flying by myself. And there's virtually nothing else that you can do in the world that happens. That moment, that kind of science infusion. It's a bit like being a singer where you stand up on the stage, I guess. But what I'm saying here is that it's not because it's life and death in a moment. So um, you that for me is memorable. That first moment, taking off by myself in the airplane to fly solo, and you fly around the airfield and you land. And that landing, by the way, is a very hard thing to do. So people underestimate it. Taking off is easy, landing is hard. So being able to land just by yourself in a plane in any condition for the first time. And my story is even more strange because I took off and I turned downwind, it's called, in the airfield. And then I was told to orbit. Orbit means fly in 360 degrees in a circle because an airliner was coming into land. I
Oh,
fly from a busy airfield. So I felt like saying to the person at the tower, hey, it's my solo. In other words, let them wait and let those 170 people in the airliner wait. I've got to get in first because it's my, you know. So that remains for me one of the foundation happiness moments is knowing that you can fly by yourself, that you're not fooling anyone, and on top of it, being thrown into the deep end because the ATC air traffic controller said now orbit in my first solo flight, which luckily I've been practicing a lot because I'm at an airfield that's quite busy. It's called Lanseria. It's an international airport. So I luckily learned to fly at a very busy international airport with all kinds of sizes of planes taking off and landing. And the radio is incredibly noisy. There's hardly a second where there's silence. Um, and now I know from flying elsewhere that that's quite a being thrown into a difficult situation. So that's my favorite memory is being able to fly solo
how
and
was the landing?
surviving.
The first landing?
Not bad, but I've had some terrible ones. All pilots will tell you that they're terrible. The pilots that I've met who say they're very good normally die because we're all trying to be good, and you're never good. You're just trying to get better. And the arrogant pilots I've met, mainly males, young males, say, they boast about their exploits, and they're not going to survive. There's a saying in flying: there's old pilots and there's bold pilots, but there's no old bold pilots.
Oh yeah, they don't survive. So old bull.
they all they've hit what we call the granite cloud.
Granite cloud. So what has been your most thrilling of the flights? Like,
The one was a crosswind. I was flying with my son, and the plane I was in was rated as certain crosswind. And each plane, with the wind blowing from across the runway, you have to be very careful because your plane obviously gets blown off the runway. So you've got to be careful of the size of the plane and the wind speed. So it was a 21 knot crosswind, and we took off, and the weather just went bad. So I said, okay, I'm going to come back and land. And we turned to land, and the wind was gusting 34 knots, which is about 70 k's an hour, which was way over this aeroplane's prescribed capacity. But my instructor, who's an old man, pretty old school guy, had shown me how to land in very, very high winds. And he said, one day you're going to have this. And lo and behold, there we were, coming into land in this incredibly gusting, really difficult situation. And the plane flies that way with the nose pointed towards the wind. And and as you land, you turn your nose to go straight, so you don't go off sideways. And I've been trained so much in that I said to my son, look, we're going to try in aviation of rule of 3. If you have a failure, you can try again, and you can try one more time, but you can't do more than 3, else something serious is going to go wrong. So I said to him, we're not going to do 3 attempts, we're going to do 1. And if it doesn't work, because we're way over the numbers here, I'll go to another airfield, which is about 70 or close to 100 kilometers away, which I didn't really want to do. So that was really right on the edge of my capacity. And I managed to get in, and it was a safe landing. And I just recalled my instructor's words and how much he trained me. And I just thanked him. I was like, wow, these guys are so wise. Your instructors who teach you things. And when you're younger, or you don't really think it'll happen, or well, it
wow.
does. So that wasn't a very affirmating, self-affirmating moment,
Got
and
to be
understanding why you train so hard.
got to be prepared for the worst. Like in the training,
Precisely.
sweat in the training so you don't bleed much during the battle.
Precisely. Yes.
What are your thoughts on seaplanes?
Well, I'm actually looking at one, a smallish one. I was thinking of purchasing one, and then I spent some time in America. For 2 months I've been traveling, and I was looking at doing a seaplane conversion. So I like them because they give you the option of both the seaplane or the water landing, as well as the landing on hard surface. So it makes sense in some parts of the country. In South Africa, not, because we have so little water. We're a very, very dry country. I like the idea. I think during the 50s they were big again with the British. They needed them for the so-called empire because they were landing and there were not a lot of airstrips, and they were having to travel quickly, and ship was just too slow. So they used those big airplanes or seaplanes to do that. The smaller ones now, I like them. I think that they get you around.
Beautiful. Now to the signature round. Name 3 people, living or dead, that you'd like to have lunch with.
Well, that's a difficult question. I think living or dead, that's the important one. I think the Queen. I'm not a royal expert.
Which one?
However, Queen Elizabeth, who's just died. I think that I didn't have much attention for her for most of my life, but then I think being older, but also seeing and understanding suddenly how long that she'd been around. I think if she was honest, if I sit with her, I think I could sit for hours. You can imagine the stories that person would tell about stuff, about world leaders, just things going on. So I think that's the one. It sounds pretty old-fashioned, and my young self would not believe I've just said that to you, but perhaps. The other one would be someone like a Gandhi. I've always had a lot of time in my podcasts looking at the Boer War, for example. I spent quite a bit of time looking at Gandhi. and his philosophies of life. I think you need to connect with people who have a deep and a huge distance in their eyes. Their minds are just not like ours, and you learn so much in a few minutes from these people. So I think it would be Gandhi, the Queen, Gandhi. Third person, I think, ironically, be someone like Thelonious Monk, a musician, or Curtis Mayfield, also musician, possibly Louis Armstrong, musician.
Second
So
part
one of
of
those three,
second part of
probably Louis
question
Armstrong.
is, yeah. Second part of question is, if you could ask one question separate to all three of them, what would it be?
What do you plan to do next?
Whom would you ask this?
I'd ask you, what are your plans?
No, no.
Oh, must I ask a famous person that?
The three people you
Okay.
named, the three people you named, you are at lunch with them. So what
What would I
question
ask
do you
them?
ask them? Yeah, one question.
Okay. I'd ask them specific questions about what I know about their histories.
So
So for the Queen, I'd say to her, talk to me a little bit about the Second World War. How did you move from being like a young girl who drove trucks around, and then shortly after that, you were like the Queen? How did that? Talk about what went through your mind. How did you manage to deal with that? Because you seem to do it, and you go from young girl who's post-adolescence into suddenly woman running the British Empire. It's like, how did you do it? So I'd ask that. Mahatma Gandhi, I think I'd say, your patience in the first phases of the Indian Congress movement, and your actions taking on the famous salt incident, and how what allows you to retain your sense of decorum when there's a huge amount of violence and noise? How did you manage to be calm in the noise? How did you do it? What mental faculties did you
hmm,
deploy? Then for Curtis Mayfield or Thelonious Monk, I'd ask questions about technique. Do you think that is it right to know everything there is to know about music theory, or should you really spend more time just feeling it? Because my personal thing is, I felt music. I've never trained, and I've always felt that I have a weakness because of that. And when I play sometimes with other people, it definitely shows up because I've got to hear it to play it, and then they will say something, they'll play in this key or that mode, and I don't know what they're talking about. So so I would like to ask people who really know what they're doing in
hmm,
instruments, how much would you weight those two,
hmm.
the trained versus the feel? Don't give me 50-50.
That would be something interesting to know. All right, next question. How to make money?
Energy, always, and ideas. You have to have an idea every minute, and then you got to act. Remember, no idea is yours. Someone has thought of the same thing. No question about it. You're not a genius. Someone has thought of something. The only thing that differentiates you and me from anyone else is acting on the idea. So act. You have to do it. Don't just study. Try and combine elements of things. Over my life, I've made money and I've lost money. And money is not everything. However, you've got to act on your idea with a view to funding that idea. So that's what I'd say. In my podcast, that's the truth as well, because I started off doing it as a labor of love, and then turned into something more business-like, and that's just. But for years, I've built up this capacity, and podcasts now are starting to make me money, and they're making me money because I built the capacity. Because I built the capacity, I didn't sit around asking a guru about how I should do it. I actually started and did a few things. So you've got to do stuff. That's my short answer. Don't
Action.
think about it. You got to do it, do it, do it. I sat on a plane coming back from Istanbul to Chicago a few weeks ago with a code writer. who's a Turkish guy, and he lives in America now. And we were chatting about this very question. And this is the answer we came to. And, he's worth a lot of money, unlike me. I was fortunate enough to get funded a trip in business class. So I sat next to him. And when you're in business and when you're in those ambits, you listen to what people say and you try and interact with folks because you get all sorts of information. And he was saying that it's by doing his coding, and for 4 or 5 hours of that 13-hour flight, he coded nonstop on his laptop. He was coding in C language,
Wow.
and he was coding trading apps, trading algorithms,
Wow.
and he did it nonstop. And I said to him, I'm very impressed. He said, that's why I make money, is because I do stuff.
Action, take action, and do
Take
stuff.
action.
Thank you.
Mm.
What
Mm.
what does art mean to you?
It's everything. Art is the difference between us and gorillas. Being able to express ourselves. It's part of my church, I guess. It allows the dark side to float away. It reveals it's a happiness function, part of beauty. You have to see and feel beauty to be inspired and to not become bitter. So art is a excuse for us to not be bitter, and everyone at any level of any culture has art for that reason. We are
Hmm.
humans and we want to express things, and then art is a positive thing. Even the dark art's a positive thing. They're not. They may be to wield something that protects you against evil, but most of the time it's something that is a statement of positive happiness. Even the dark arts, as I say, even the most traumatic artists. I just saw Van Gogh at the Art Institute in Chicago. I just went to that to a gallery there, and I realized that even his dark stuff is positive. It's infused with light, and so I think it's a way of squeezing terrible things out of our souls. That's what art is, I think.
What value does art provide for the world or society per se?
I mean, it's a point at which we can all agree that there is an illustrious character or person that we can aspire to become. We can be like that. We can practice the guitar to be like Jimi Hendrix. We can try and paint to be like Van Gogh. People have always shown us the way with art. You don't do a comparison. It's a way of saying, if they can do that, you can do something approximate that. So I think being able to understand things, especially music, where even music from different scales, the raga scale that India uses for the Indian musicians is something that I really like. The Lebanese scale, which sounds like Lebanese music, or the raga scale sounds like Indian music, but that everyone can hear those notes
Hmm.
and they can understand the happiness of those notes together, the bubbly jauntiness of them. Doesn't matter what language you speak. I think that's what is really a positive thing.
Hmm. Amazing. We actually had an episode who from with a secretary of a opera of a in Belgium. So we are talking about Western classical music and opera, and it was amazing. And you also spoke about Queen Victoria and she becoming a queen, and her first prime minister was Winston Churchill.
Yeah,
So,
can you believe it? Yes.
so we had an episode about that as well. Winston Churchill, specifically a whole episode on Winston Churchill, his work of lives, and that was the first time I got to know that he was about to get shot, or he would have died in South Africa.
Close call.
Yeah.
Mm,
Wow.
mm.
Interesting world. So it would have been great to know about how it was to the Queen to know this. I would also like to have Gandhi, the Queen, and Churchill in the same room and see what they discussed.
That would be quite a noisy meeting, I think.
I think the Queen would
Yeah.
just watch, and Gandhi and Churchill would
Yes.
be fighting.
Because Churchill didn't like Gandhi by the end of it. He respected Gandhi at first, but then Gandhi gave all his Boer War medals because he won a lot of medals in the Boer War. Gandhi, he was involved in carrying stretchers. He started the Indian stretcher bearers company in Durban and took 300 Indian stretcher bearers into the Boer War and carried both British and mainly British, but also Boer soldiers out of conflict and coming close to death a number of times himself. So he won a lot of medals. It's not known, but Gandhi got a lot of medals in the Boer War. And I can't remember the date, but at some point in the run up to Indian independence, Gandhi gave the medals back to Churchill, who thought that was a treasonous act because
Keeping
Churchill
the
was
medals.
a man of the empire, and he believed in military prowess and honor. So he took that very personally, Churchill, that he couldn't stand it. And of course, Churchill and Gandhi never met, except on that mountain. They never met after that, but they never met on that mountain, but they passed each other
Hmm.
at the Spionkop mountain, but they never met. So having them together, you could just imagine what they would be saying to each other.
It would be very
Yeah.
interesting. What is a life changing advice you have received?
My great aunt, who started the farm I grew up in, the farm was around after the First World War, but after the Second, my great aunt fought in the war with my great uncle, my grandfather's brother, and his wife is my great aunt. She said something to me when I started working. She said, "Haven't you started a company yet?" And I said, "I'm getting there." I was about 22. She said, everyone in the Latham family who's your age has done something like that. So in other words, she was saying, come on, you're letting the side down. But then she said something to me about investments. She said, if you make an investment, don't forget the rule of thirds, which is 1/3 shares, 1/3 property, 1/3 gold, or something like that. So that's how I invested since then, and it's worked. So I'd say that is one of the secrets: is you've got to buy property when you get money. You have to invest somewhere in shares or your own shares of something, some kind, and you should really buy some kind of metal to base value on, preferably gold. So that is such wise advice I got, and I've used it, and it really works.
That's a great advice, even for the young entrepreneurs listening to this. But the second part, the property, you cannot buy it very immediately, right? I mean, it has to take some time to invest. So, what would you say
Well,
about that?
true. Buy it early. If you look at the amount of money you're paying in rent, multiply by 12, multiply by 5 years, and then prepare to get a shock because you're paying hundreds of thousands of dollars already. So why don't you go and buy a piece of property? Very seldom does the value of property drop. You must be clever about it, but it rises. So what you do is you buy property, you sell it, you make a profit, you buy more property. Once you've bought and sold property once, that if you're using your street smarts, you're always making money. So it funds itself. So you don't have to pay it off. Let's just say you buy a property at $500,000 US and you sell it for 850,000 US. You made a profit. Plus you pay the interest back that you paid. Now you've got 850 million. So you put 700,000 dollars down on a house that's worth 900,000. You only have 200,000 to pay off. Then you sell it in 2 years' time. That now you're paying all the interest and everything. Sell it in 2 years' time. If you made a correct choice at 3 to 6% per annum, so you're looking at maybe $980,000. You're paying it off. You made profit again,
Hmm.
and you just keep going. I made a mistake once with my wife. I'm still married to the woman I married in 1901. I've been married to her for 30 years, over 30. We buy houses together. We made a mistake once, but luckily it didn't damage us too much. So out of the 6 houses we've owned, we made a mistake once and we made profit on each sale. So that's what you do. You flip that concept and you say, okay, I'm going to rent my own house while I pay it off, but I'm going to live in it. And then I'm going to sell it for a profit. And then I'm going to sell that house for a profit. You don't get attracted to a house and say, I'm going to live and die in this thing forever and pay it off over 900 years. And I'll still owe money when I die. Don't think like that. You've got to think of it as a value chain. And I know you've probably been told this by other people who do property sales, but that's the secret, is that you You buy in location. It's not always easy to see that, I accept. But take the hit on transport if you're buying out of town. Take those hour commute. You still own your own house. You're not paying some landlord somewhere who's not going to fix your geyser or the solar system or the Wi-Fi. It's you. It's one-to-one. It's you fixing these things. So you can control your life more effectively. The money, you're not paying a landlord, which really hurts after a while. You're paying this money, this rent all the time. Look at the tens of thousands of dollars you're paying, or rupees, hundreds of thousands, millions of rupees all the time to someone who's quite an idiot, usually the owner of the property. The landlords are notorious. So that's the answer. Buy it as soon as you can. Sell it after a while. Build up the value. Make sure you're not buying romantically because you like the eaves, but you're careful about where you're putting the money. You don't make a loss. Property does not make a loss.
So what was the mistake you made, and what was that a loss?
Yes. No, we broke even actually on the sale, but it was technically a loss against inflation. So we bought a house in a place that the bank had as redlined. They said that it was the whole area was dropping in value, and they didn't want to give us the money for it. And we just ignored the bank stupidly and took the loan anyway and bought the house. And it did drop. The value of the area was dropping. So, and that was my second house. And so you learn by mistakes. So we swore to each other, my wife and I, that the next time we did that, we listened to the bank. We wouldn't just think we knew everything. And since then, it's gone much better, I'm pleased to say. We were paying 2 bonds on 2 houses, paying off the one plus a new one. And then we managed to sell the one that made our money back just, but lost if you look at interest. But it didn't hurt us too much. So you really need to, I think, linked to the property stories, you need to be in partnership. So once you've married or have a partner, you should have the same views about this, I believe. And you must go together. Hopefully both partners are working, because you can fund a double size deposit than just you working. If you think about it, your wife's got a good job, you got a good job, your deposit's suddenly big. So you can put down a big deposit on a big house, and then in 2 years' time, you sell it for a big profit.
You don't wait
It just
till
makes sense to me.
you don't wait till you pay off the mortgage. You just flip it.
No. No, that's old school. No, I mean, you'll be paying mortgage constantly, but you'll always be paying a different mortgage on a different house.
Yeah.
And you'll
You
have
make
the
profits.
deposit.
Yeah.
Yeah, you make profits. Plus you pay the mortgage, and then you pay the next mortgage, and in one day, you pay off the house because you've lived there a while. Or I'm now 60. I've lived in this house for 20 years. I brought my kids up. Now we're about to sell it. Where are we going to go? Somewhere smaller and what do we do with the profit? Buy 2 pieces of property, not 1. That's the rule. If you sell property, you buy property with the money. You don't put it in anything else. So that's the thirds.
So it keeps
Buying a property.
revolving in the same thirds.
Correct.
Very
Yeah, it
interesting.
keeps revolving, and it gets you more back over time. Even with the mistake I made, we can still say that so far we've managed to achieve our aims on that end together, my wife and I. Importantly, I must say that together, but also by doing the thing of going, I'm not going to be trapped in the bond life cycle of buying a house and then trying to think, oh, I've got a bond of X% of it. How many, what the people do with this thing? Go, okay, it's really valuable. In a couple of years, I'm going to pack everything up, sell it, and go somewhere else. There's a sense of freedom in that. Because at least I'm not paying a silly landlord who, arrives to check on my house and doesn't fix the ceiling when it's leaking. And it's, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
It's still,
totally.
I'm my own landlord. Yeah. If I mess up the gutters, it's me.
Your house, your rules. And you
There's
also...
a sense of freedom there. Yes, correct. Yeah.
You said you started with labor of love for the podcast, but now it's also making you a good revenue. So how does one make money with podcasts? Because it's such a niche you have to build, and then it's a whole different game.
Yes. So the number of the rules of podcasts is, one, you must be doing something that is missing. You can't repeat what everyone else is doing. So you need to have a unique perspective on things. So the way I do it is I listen to things, and when there's a gap, and I have a fascination with various things, then I know there's a gap for other people. It's a kind of simple rule. I'm not unique. I'm just a human. So I know, I was looking at the Anglo-Boer War in 2017. There's no podcast for it. I'm like, why? It's one of the biggest events in the world that had Churchill and Gandhi in it, And no one's done a podcast on this. There was BBC did 4 TV style podcasts, which was nothing like what I was thinking about. So I knew there's a gap. Same thing with plane crash diaries. Everyone does plane crashes, but no one was doing the safety component. I focus on how a crash leads to safety improvements. It sounds counterintuitive, but that's worked. And a lot of pilots listen to it because of that ambit, because it's about making you better as a pilot and so on. So you find the gap.
So in the
Once you
plane
find
diary, you actually crash the planes. Is it your own
no,
experience or the crashes
no,
that have happened in history?
no, it's famous crashes that happened. And
Okay.
then I go over the causes and then the causes lead to an improvement in safety.
Uh-huh.
So a plane crashed because it didn't have TCAS, which is collision avoidance system. So TCAS is then included in all airliners now, for example. It's a law. You have to have TCAS. So fewer planes crash into each other. Ground proximity warning systems, it's called. So now fewer planes hit the ground when they're landing and doing other things, and so on and so on.
Mm.
So I just look at the crashes that led directly to improvements in those safety things. And because it's technical, but also it's storytelling. A lot of pilots listen to it. So I found that that's the gap we're talking about, Manya, is that you can look at a gap and say, okay, so that's the first rule of the podcast to make money, is it's doing what other
Filling
people
the
want you
gaps.
to do. But also something that you must be obsessed with. You must have an innate feel for it. You can't pretend. People here are pretending at work, or you're pretending to have an interest. They run, they flee. So the influencers say, okay, now let's talk about something because it's going to make some money, that kind of thing. You get a very short-term response for your energies. It's a long-term response when it's something that you're fascinated with, and in 2 years' time, you're going to be still fascinated with it. So that's the second thing. The third thing is 6 months rule. You don't start anything successful less than 6 months and doing it weekly. So you've got to have that in mind, that you're planting a field and you're going to grow a crop, and it's going to take you 6 months. If you think I'm going to try and I need money, and you're going to start this podcast business, you're in the wrong game, because it takes a long time to build that up. Have access to analytics, and then also be aware of the monetizing side. I mean, PayPal. I use PayPal, QR codes. I have an agency selling now, and then I always communicate directly with my listener. Don't have a third party doing it for you, or an intern. So emails come to me, I answer, I personalize the emails, each one is answered to, and I get quite a few a day from my multiple podcasts. And I talk to them, and what do? They go and tell someone else to listen. Each time that you're marketing in that way, by talking to someone, then someone else hears, and someone else hears, and someone else hears. And that viral power is much, much more potent than buying a billboard. Really. I mean, it's when someone sells you as a positive experience to their friends, it's a win-win. As far as I'm concerned. So that's a number of the things.
I'm really love and obsessed about talking about different cultures in different countries. Hence, I want to talk to people from every country of the world, and I've been doing that for almost 2 years. So I mean, I don't know, but now I know I'm doing this full time. So I'm at a point where I need to really consider how to start monetizing. That's why I was asking how to reach that audience base, or what comes first. Does the audience base come first, or marketing, or how?
Now, the audience base, you've got to try and build it up by doing what you're doing. So if you've got that fascination, and as far as I'm concerned, I mean, I'm not the blueprint of the system. I just found that it worked for me. And I've read all the takeaways that you read about how to do this and that, and how to get more people to listen. And I found that as I've said to you, it's finding the topic that you really do know, that you personally can understand and want other people to know about. It's having some experience, I think, must be said. I spent a lot of time since the 1980s in broadcasting, and a lot of people think they can just podcast, but they don't really know how to use this, or how to script. All my podcasts are script. I script from scratch. I write 4,000 words per podcast, and I've got 2 a week. And I've got a full-time job as a CEO. So I write 8,000 words, and then I broadcast and I produce the whole thing myself. So my costs are low. You've got to keep your costs right down. I think that's really it. You've got to be, I think, slightly mad. Because when I tell people that I do a weekly podcast and I've not missed one since 2017, that's like almost 7 years of weekly podcasts, which I don't have anyone do for me. I do it myself. I do the writing, I do the editing, I do the recording and the production, the marketing, the website, you name it. So between you and me, Tanmay, I think we've got to be a little bit nuts in this podcasting world. And just a warning, I think, for those folks who know everyone's in the podcasting game or trying to be and so on. You've got to be careful with that thing. You've got to really want to do this game. It's very difficult. Podcasting in audio is much more difficult than video. I make videos. I make movies, and the audio side of it is the nightmare. Anyone can point a camera, but try and record good sound. Very hard to do. So I just think that all of the above is, aim for as good a quality sound as you've got. You've got a really good setup, and you were very cautious with me at the start, telling me where to go with the mic and so on. It's really important. And good luck with the monetizing. Get your audience up. Get people talking about you. Find the gap. And then you suddenly you become the go-to on certain topics.
Absolutely.
And then you have a library. You have a long tail. I speak to people. I did my podcast to 2020 in Anglo-Boer War. I get virtually a daily email from the audience. I get thousands of listens every week because someone's always finding it. There's a long tail of the internet. So as long as you can host it forever, or at least put it up and try and let it live, the longer it's up there, the more money it makes if it has some kind of unique. In my case, I do a lot of historical stuff, so I don't have an age limit on it. It's not like, and now, the news, and this is how Twitter is now going to be X or something. I don't have that problem. People want to know about the Falklands War, Stalingrad, Anglo-Boer War, South African border war, or South African history. It's evergreen. So I try and pick those subjects.
How do you get to Stalingrad? That's in Russia, and how do you Stalingrad is in Russia? That one, right?
Yes.
So,
good question. Yeah. I mean, I've had experience. I was a soldier for 2 years. Experienced. I was in battles, so I understand warfare to some extent. And then in 2013, I was the online editor, Business Day Financial Mail, which is a publication. And then I ended up at the TV arm, and then Russia invaded Crimea. And the American ambassador the Russian ambassador I contacted here, Mikhail Prokhorov, in Johannesburg, in Pretoria. And I said, I'm interested to do a story. And he said, in 2 weeks, no journalist has phoned me to ask about my side of the story. So I said, well, I'm going to come through and talk to you. So I sat with this ambassador who said he's going to give me half an hour, and he gave me 2 hours, basically a history lesson about why he believed that Russia owned Crimea. A long thing. He spent a lot of time explaining art, Chekhov, the famous short story writer, and all sorts of things. And then I realized that Stalingrad forms the core of Russia's patriotic war philosophy. Putin talks about it. So I need to understand this thing because it's important. And I didn't know how important. I didn't know it was going to lead last year to the invasion of Ukraine, obviously. But I knew I needed to understand Putin and Russia and what it's about. And after that, and having read Putin's 2,000-word personal essay on this a few years ago, I realized that we're in real trouble in planet Earth about this. And this is just the start of something that's a long-term war, unfortunately. And unfortunately, Tanmay, it's going to involve all of us. So you asked about BRICS. So that's why I got to Stalingrad. It's because I needed to understand the deep-seated need for Russia's state. It's empire state. It's empire builders there, like Putin and Peter the Great and these guys, Catherine, to understand their minds. Why? What makes this person tick post-Second World War?
Exactly.
Makes him,
it's unimaginable to have a war like this. We haven't had in hundred of years. Like, it's almost been a century. So in your process of talking to so many people and doing this Stalingrad podcast, what do you think? What is their main motivation for war and what they're doing right now in Ukraine?
People argue about it, but from what I understand, it's nation state. So the USSR was a large state of many countries plugged in together, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It was a Russian empire. It was supposedly Soviets. In other words, Soviets is the name given to the Marxist parliament or group of people that decide what to do in any country. It's called a Soviet. So it was Soviet republics. But in essence, it was Russia who was driving it from a territory empire, like an ancient empire point of view. So when they lost that in 91, 92, they lost Ukraine in 92, became independent. That Ukraine is one of the fundamental connections that Russia has to Western Europe. Russia is schizophrenic. It's a 36-letter alphabet. Part of those letters, a third of them are Cyrillic, which looks like Chinese. So it's the culture of the people who rule the country are schizophrenics. They don't know if they're East, they don't know if they're West. But they definitely know that historically the princes of Ukraine, Poland, and Sweden, which used to control what is Ukraine now until relatively recently, Russia fought them over hundreds of years to control their territory, which is known as Ukraine. And in fact, Kiev is older than Moscow. The capital of Ukraine is older than Moscow. And the Russian princes that used to control, in feudal terms, the area that is now Central Western Europe, were ostensibly Russian. So that's why Russian people like Putin thinks that they own Ukraine across the Dnieper River. That Ukraine technically, historically, was fought for with the Swedes, who were a really potent force in the 1700s, for example, and Poland. And they believe that the USSR split up, which was broken up, they believe, because America and NATO broke them. They don't actually understand or don't want to believe that they had a weak system that just broke because communism doesn't work in the way that they had structured it. And they wanted to blame an external force. They look at and use NATO as a tool to talk about the invasion. So they're constantly in their minds are going to be invaded from the West. Russia, invaded by Germany, invaded by NATO. And so they can stimulate their own culture, their own patriots internally to fear that from the West. That's it. And then they use Stalingrad as a symbol because it's the Third Reich invaded them in 1941. And 42 launched attacks into Stalingrad, was failed in 43, January 43, February. The Sixth Army was destroyed in Stalingrad, 1 million Germans dead or taken prisoner. That defensive tactic, how they worked in Stalingrad, never give up, fight to the death, was exactly what the Ukrainians did to them in Mariupol, for example. It's deeply rooted in these people's narrative stories to each other. We must understand that as global dwellers, that's what makes them, doesn't make me tick or you, it makes them tick. So you need to understand that, because when you have a discussion with a Russian about this, you can't use the thing about it's wrong or you don't own Ukraine. That's not the debate going on here in their minds. They're thinking long term like this, and you've got to understand that, and then use your geopolitical understanding to make sense of it. Because for me, what can I do about it? Nothing. Or you. But what can I know about what could happen next? I can do a lot about that. In my life, what can I get ready for? When Russia invaded Ukraine last year, I said to everyone, and we did analysis, risk analysis, oil, vegetable oil price, and the price of corn and maize in particular is going to rocket. And it did. It went up by 30. In my country, we went up by 300% sunflower oil, because Ukraine is 33% of the world's sunflower oil. So it go do. I mean, so we need to know the threats to our existence based on people like the Russians playing games with Ukraine. Whether they're right or wrong, you can argue about it all night. I don't care. Really don't care. What I care about is why they're doing it, why they think they're doing it, and what the effect's going to have on me and you next week.
I have a follow up question on that. In the era which we are living, territory, how does that matter? Because in World War One and Two, the natural resources and countries' development depended on the natural resources that the land holds. That's why they went and conquered and expanded. But now it's becoming all soft, right? It's all internet. Most of the money is being made by all the soft power things. So what is the need for, I want to have the whole empire back, or I want to see that lining on the map, or I want that map which was there previously back again, and I'm going to shed all the blood of so many soldiers for that. And it's going to keep going on for so many years. Why?
It's a psychosis. I think it's a mental psychosis. It's an illness, clearly. That and it's also a greed and power motif, because if you can convince people that you message, in other words, you control all the media, and you can message people inside your country and convince them of these facts, you can then set up the control over treasure in your own country based on what you and your friends get access to. You can control the oligarchs, you can control the elites. So it becomes a greed motif, and that's an ancient principle. You mentioned Mongolians. And it's a human response, Alexander the Great, etc. They may have individual needs to do this, but they prey on each of us as humans' capacity to feel fear and to respond in a group, a community. And then the us and them, to say these people want to deform our economy by taking us. So, yes, logically, it makes no sense, because there's Bitcoin and the flow of capital around the world is instantaneous, where it's allowed to flow. The idea of a nation state is pretty old fashioned, really, but it's also not, because it's going to be at the heart of Taiwan China's conflict coming up. It's at the heart of Russia's conflict with NATO. It sees in the EU. It's petrified of the EU, but it isn't. It's using the idea of being afraid of NATO in the Russians. I don't think Putin's personally afraid of NATO. I think he just likes to say that, you know. It's a bit like Hitler and his bunker as well. How much do these people actually believe their narrative and become, over time, or like Trump, they then believe their narrative because they've said it so often, they repeat a lie so often that even they believe it. So maybe it's a bit of that. I don't know. But it's true what you say, is that it's the irrelevance of doing business in the global world. Unfortunately for me and you, at the same time, the relevance is growing against nation states. So these empire states are building empires again, and that's the thing to fear. I think, as a human on planet Earth, is these people are going to cause trouble for us. They're going to start firing tactical nuclear weapons into parts of Western Europe. They're going to fire chemical weapons. They've been tinkering with a few examples already, we know. But the chances of this happening are pretty high. In the next few weeks, will the Wagner Group actually attack parts of Poland? It's possible. Watch the space. Watch the Baltic states. They've always been tussled over for hundreds of years. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. Kaliningrad, which is part of Russia, is the other side of Estonia. It's 60 k's of a Baltic state and then back to Russia. What do you think Russia is going to do there? They're going to want a little, their trains go between this time now, and their helicopter flies over their trains from NATO watching them. This is not a sustainable situation, nation state-wise. We're talking about nation states, your question. So this is going to come around again. These things we have to keep an eye on. Your country and China. I mean, it doesn't matter who's right, who's wrong. You say, you'll tell me something, the Chinese will tell me something else. I'm watching this, going, these are two countries who can set off a nuclear weapon. Your country and the Chinese. When you guys start fighting, in southern Africa here, I listen very carefully to what your points of view are and what may happen next and so on. So those are nation states we talked about.
Yeah, talking about nuclear
It's
and
intrinsic.
India has nuclear on both the sides, right? Pakistan and China. So, yeah, it's a different
I
story.
know.
But I'm very happy that the current prime minister, he's not leading by fear. It's a democratically elected and very popular leader. It's not what other people in the countries we just spoke about are doing by force and with fear, ruling with force and fear. So in that way, I think it is very peaceful and good, for
Mm.
unless something goes very haywire in the geopolitics of the world. So
So that's your question about the geopolitical situation. I mean, why do nation states do this when we pass nation states? And unfortunately, we've come back to them. That's what's happened here.
mm,
With our electronic platforms, Makes no difference. The historical effect to me is somewhere between the 20s and 30s and in the late 1800s. Those two periods is what it looks like to me as a historian now. With electricity, Twitter, that's all secondary. That stuff is a panacea. It's a little layer on the top of empire state building again, nation state power mongering. That's where the real world lives.
I hope it doesn't get too bad because everybody has new. I mean, it'll be the end of civilization if. I mean, let's hope it doesn't go there. Back to the signature questions. What is the most priceless gift you have received?
Gift. I think, I mean, my mother had a capacity for, as a child growing up in apartheid South Africa, she infused that concept that everyone is kind of the same. And growing up in the Zulu culture as well meant that the gift was not. I'm one of those curious people that when I meet with people, I can talk to a president and a street sweeper simultaneously. I talk to them the same way. And it's my mother. That's a gift I think she gave me, was to show me that you just you don't have preconceptions. You know, you've got to be able to not say no. Is to just have a open mind and listen. So I think that's the gift. That's a kind of gift of that I for years have underestimated, and recently it's become clear to me that when I see how other people have grown up, you know, I was kind of fortunate to have that layered into me. Yeah.
Amazing. That's it. It interrelates to everything that we spoke about today, right? Apartheid and yeah, great. What is on your bucket list next?
I want travel, more travel. I'm going to be doing some music streaming. The next thing is music streaming with my close friend, a bass player, musician. He's double bass player. We've been playing in bands since 1995 together, and we toured Southern Africa between 2002 and 2019, playing music. And he and I have got a plan to do an acoustic recording thing, which we're starting this week. So that's my main list of immediate. The other is I'm launching a new podcast series looking at the Winter War, which is Finland. Russia invaded Finland and like with Ukraine, made a serious mistake. And the war didn't end quickly. And there are echoes of what may happen next. So that's why I'm doing that one. I don't think Russia will invade Finland, but somewhere around that region, as we just said. So I'm doing a podcast to understand that and get ready for it mentally. And then I'm looking at moving around South Africa, maybe moving to the coast, selling my house here, work in the business. I can do it remote. So I'll be maybe doing it the coast. Maybe I'll be doing it from Australia. Maybe I'll be doing it from America. That's coming up. So I suppose that's the big picture.
How do you manage so many things? You are into music, you produce podcasts, which again takes a lot of time. You're a CEO and you have another business at the end, and you play guitar and music. How do you manage your time?
I delegate. So my senior manager or managers in the small company I own, these all run, are very enabled. In other words, they're very empowered, and they take most of the decisions on a minute by minute basis. So I'm helping all the time, and I work every day, but I don't have to do everything, and I don't have to think about all the decisions. Only the strategic ones, and when clients need a communication or something. The rest of the time, it runs itself. It runs through the staff. So it's delegate power. Then I use my time in compressed form. So I do specific things at specific times. I get up early in the morning, road run, start working at 7 a.m. I found those first 2 hours early in the morning, and anyone who's done the kind of things I'm doing will tell you this. That's when everything happens. No one phones you. All emails are dead. 7 to 9 a.m., that's your 2 hours. You do 80% of my work is done over that period. Then I do I compartmentalize. I do the music at a certain time in the day, normally late afternoon. That's part of decompressing. So it's a mental thing. So I suppose that's it. I've chopped up the day. It's not weekly or monthly. It's actually days. I chop parts of my day, and then I use it for different things. So I think that's the answer.
How many podcasts are ongoing right now? Like live?
There are three. So one is the history of South Africa, which is the big one. Then there is Plane Crash Diaries, which I do monthly, and I'm about to look at my latest version. And then South African border wars, which is the history of the conflict between South Africa and Angola and the other countries during apartheid. And unfortunately, I was a veteran of that conflict, so I was approached by some other veterans who asked me to do something on it, and I've just finished 114 episodes, and now I'm in a so that's live, but I'm going from weekly in that to bi-monthly to because I finished the period, the 23 wars, and now I'm looking at moments, doing operations or particular years and so on. So that's the short
Wow.
answer.
You were in the army. Is it a draft system in South Africa like Israel where everybody has to go in the army, or did you choose to go? And if you chose to go, why did you choose?
It was 1981 too. I was drafted as a white male South African. You all had to do 2 years full-time service and 2 years camps. So I had three options then. One was to leave the country. One was to go to prison for 6 years,
If you don't
being
follow
conscientious.
the draft, you have to go to the prison for 6 years.
6 years. And not just the prison, the detention barracks, military prison, which is far worse. And the third was to do the military service. So I had three options as a 17-year-old. And I just didn't have anywhere to go. I couldn't leave South Africa. I just didn't have the capacity. And I just didn't have the guts to go to jail for 6 years. One of my friends did. He was an objector politically. But I just could not do that. So I was a bit weak. So I thought, let me survive the 2 years, and then I'll make a choice, make a call. So that's my answer.
But you recently again were into the army, you said, right? In past 10.
No, I work at the police. Part of my training, I thought, well, let me plow it back. Now, it's a democracy. We have problems with crime. So I'm trained. So I thought, let me go and work with the police force. They'll have me. And luckily, they had me. And so I'm working as a community police forum member in my area, which means I patrol once a week at night with the police.
What is your biggest disappointment?
I think not becoming like a world famous soccer player or something, or cricketer. I really wanted to. I love playing sports. I do to this day. I run at the moment. I play cricket still. And I really felt that I'd love to have been a really good sports person, top of the game, national sport. So I think that's a disappointment. That I'd love to have been good enough to do that. So I was never good enough to do that, obviously, but that is a slight disappointment in my life. I mean, damn, I would love to have been able to go to the IPL. Imagine playing in the IPL as a batter, preferably.
What
Yeah.
what gets you excited about the future?
I think the biggest thing is I can understand now that I can actually do something about my future, but I can do nothing about the future. I think that's the thing to concentrate on for me, is to say, I can be only as positive and negative as I want to be. And the world impinges on your capacity to do this. The world stresses and people can change that view. But in the end, it's really still me that's allowing external forces to dominate my thinking about that. So it's knowing that I can do something in the future. I have some kind of personal decision freedom. I'm not in prison. I have no debt. Those two big things mean that I can technically tomorrow drop everything and just go somewhere. So that's what I think is freedom
Freedom of the
to make the
future.
decision. Freedom. Yeah, freedom of the future to make a decision. Exactly. Yeah. But not much freedom in the future to decide whether or not Putin or NATO will go to war, I'm afraid. But I'll know what I'm going to do in that situation. Hmm. I mean, the thing I'm enjoying the most is road running. Are you still there? Yes. The thing I like to do the most is road running. Um, so that's my fun thing. I run half marathons, and I've just discovered that I'm
What is your favorite movie?
Shawshank Redemption.
Amazing. What is your favorite book?
Ooh. It's called Commando by Denise Rates.
What's your favorite food?
Yeah, it would be curry, and it would be probably um, chicken.
Okay.
No, chicken
What
curry.
are what are your thoughts on NFTs and crypto?
I think NFTs are overplayed, but I think crypto is going to change some of the ways in which you do business. I'm a bit concerned that it's the dark web using crypto, arms dealers, drug dealers. But also don't like banks. So, and the world financial system is dominated by Europe and America, and that's just not right. Particularly
Hmm.
London and New York. So anything that upends established elite order, I'm kind of in favor of, with the proviso that's not too destructive and that it's not controlled by some other warlord somewhere else. So
Hmm.
I think I have friends working in crypto, and I think it's the valuable future. But I think NFTs, I have no interest in NFTs. I think it's a scam.
If you had some time, I was going to ask you to play a guitar. Do you have a guitar around you,
I have a
or
guitar.
a couple of chords you could play?
You want me to play something? Hang on a second. Did you hear that?
Thank you so much. Thank you
Well,
so
nice to
much.
speak to you. Thanks for having me, Tanya.
It was great to have you. Any parting word for the audience?
Just good luck in the next couple of years of IPL. Maybe and hopefully I'll get across there at some point to watch. I don't know if you appreciate IPL, but I really do. And I'm looking at Dhoni carrying on at least another year or two, although here he may retire. And Kohli, I think I didn't really respect him a few years ago, but I think he's now one of my favorite cricketers to watch, Virat Kohli. He went through a period where he was kind of a bit of a brat, but now he's just fantastic to watch. I think he's got a lot of massive skills emotionally in cricket, and I think he's
Which is
still
your
playing.
favorite IPL team?
Rajasthan Royals. I like watching them play. Mumbai Indians, of course, such big names, although they haven't done too well recently.
Mm.
I think those are the two
Mhm.
that I like.
Okay.
Yeah.
So looking forward to have you here. And yes, for cricket, sure, definitely. Thank you so much. Any feedback or testimonials you would have for your experience at our show today?
Well, it's been lovely speaking to you, speaking to a professional. Your questions are deep, and I like the style and the format that you've got. So I know that you're going to do well if you're not doing well already. I don't have your analytics, but I presume they're good. And thank you so much, and the honor to be chatting to you and being exposed to your vast audience. So thanks, Tanmay.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Have a great week ahead.
Yes, you too. Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Salagati, as they say in Zulu. Goodbye.
Acha. Goodbye. Salagaki. This episode is brought to you by Tanmay Shah. That's me. Best way to support this show is by sharing this with your friends and dropping a comment and review on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. You can become my patron and a sponsor. That's not all. You can buy Rocklaz merchandise and NFTs and much more. See all the links in description for details.
Rocklaz Radio.
Rocklaz.
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 Rocklaz Radio with Tanmay Shah.